Tales from the Sand. He can still remember the sight of Princess Elia and her children's bodies at the foot of the Iron Throne. He can still remember how mangled baby Aegon's head was smashed in beyond recognition. He can still remember the look of perverse satisfaction on Robert's face as Tywin Lannister laid the bodies at the foot of throne as proof of his loyalty. He can still remember arguing with Robert for days on end about how the princess and her children's deaths were unnecessary, were barbaric. He remembers Robert claiming that Lya would never wish to look upon the Dragonspawn once she became his queen. He remembered arguing no shouting at Robert that Lyanna would more than likely be horrified that Robert had condoned such an atrocity, had essentially climbed over the dead princess and her children's bodies to claim his throne. Silently, he added that perhaps when Lya came back she might also be carrying Dragonspawn with her, if his suspicions were correct. It came as a relief then when the missive came from Starfall indicating where Lyanna had been kept by Rhaegar throughout the war. He rode with 6 companions first to Storm's End to lift the siege there and to get the Tyrells and their bannermen to dip their banners. Then after a month's hard riding they finally came to Dorne, the desert homeland of Princess Elia. In a tower far from the battle, far from the fighting, he found 3 of the finest knights of the Kingsguard standing in front of the tower, preventing him from rescuing his sister. They fought fiercely, they fought honorably, but at the end of it all they still died, the Kingsguard and 5 of his companions all dead. He rushed up the tower but was too late to save his sister. Lyanna Stark died in a bed of blood with a crown of blue roses in one hand and a promise on her lips. Ned took the babe from her, unsure of what he was going to do, how he was going to explain the babe. He rode to Starfall, first to give Lady Ashara Dawn and her brother back. 3 horses rode out to Starfall. When they arrived the castle was in a state of mourning. Of course they would be, the whole of Dorne would be in mourning, for they had lost their princess, lost her to the cold-hearted deviance of a man known as a lion, and to her husband's madness. When he meets Ashara Dayne he sees a speck of the woman she was before. Harrenhal, grief and motherhood have worn into her, have drawn thick lines into her forehead. Though her violent eyes still look hauntingly beautiful, the laughter seems to have died in them. She says nothing when he hands her Dawn and offers his condolences. But when the babe John, he has decided to call him, begins to fuss, she perks up and speaks. He's Rhaegar's child, isn't he? Ned is unsure how to reply. He has a lie half formed on his lips, when she presses a finger to his mouth and says, "Do not think of lying to me, Lord Eddard. You were not good at lying at Harrenhal, and I doubt you would have improved since then. The boy is Rhaegar's and your sister's." Ned simply nods, helpless and unsure of what to say or do now. She always knew how to see past him, even when they danced at Harrenhal. "What will you do with him? You can't very well bring him back to King's Landing with you, can you? Your friend King Robert will kill him." Ned wants to argue with her, wants to shout that Robert is a better man than that. But he knows deep down, in his heart of hearts, that when it comes to Targaryens, Robert is as mad as Aerys was about them. He is silent for a moment before he speaks, the words coming out as nothing more than a whisper. "I mean to claim him as my own." Ashara laughs then. "Oh Ned, dearest Ned, your intentions are honorable, no doubt. But what of your Tully wife? What will she have to say when you bring the boy home and claim him as your own? She will never understand why you did it, will she, Ned? No better to leave him here with me, where he will be safe and protected." He is stunned by the suggestion. "My lady, I couldn't know. He is my responsibility. I promised Lya." Ashara looks at him then with a look she gave him once at Harrenhal. "Yes, that's all very well and good, but if Lyanna and Rhaegar had had more sense, you wouldn't have had to make any promises, and you wouldn't have to lie. No, leave the boy here with me, Ned. Here at least he will know he is loved and cared for. And besides, he can grow up besides our daughter also." Ned swallows and feels his heart sink in his chest. "Ashara." He begins meaning to beg her to see sense. But she shakes her head stubbornly. "No, Ned. Leave the boy here. Let him grow up loved and cared for. Let him grow up with his cousin, with our daughter, Ned. You can go back to Winterfell with your Tully wife and your children with her. Let me stay here, let our daughter stay here. Let the world think that the 2 of them are mine, They whisper that it was Brandon who bedded me at Harrenhal. Let them believe it. From now on your Lia's boy is mine and Brandon's bastard son. Just as our daughter is mine and Brandon's bastard daughter. I won't let you smirch your name for some foolish cause, nor shall I let you take my daughter away from me. He wants to argue with her. He wants to make her see that their daughter would be well loved for and cared at Winterfell just as Jon would be, though he knows somewhere deep down that that could never be. So instead he swallows deeply and says, "Very well then, but when they are 8, they will come and foster with me and mine at Winterfell. I will do as you say, Ashara, but please I promised Lya I would protect her boy." Ashara merely nods then, tears beginning to well up in her eyes, and he desperately wants to go and comfort her, but he knows that that is no longer his place. He has a wife now, and he must do right by her, he must. So he stands up to leave, passing Jon to Ashara, and just before he leaves though he says to her, "His name is Jon, Lya's boy." He hears Ashara say something in response, and then he has mounted his horse and has ridden on back north with Howland, 1,000 thoughts whirring in his head. Howland is a silent companion for the whole ride north. The only time they speak is when they discuss where to make camp for the night. He had sent a raven from Starfall before leaving informing Robert of Lyanna's death, and that same night swore Howland to secrecy about Lya's boy. When he enters the courtyard in Winterfell, he feels a deep ache begin to bloom in his chest, as he remembers similar entrances made when he would come back from the Vale. Those times his father, his mother, Brandon, Lya and Benjen would all be in the courtyard waiting for him, with a hug, a smile, or a playful smack on the back. This time, though Winterfell is bleak and full of ghosts, he wanders the castle feeling empty, drowning in memories. There are times when he is alone with Benjen and the two of them reminisce about times long since past. He tells Benjen about Jon and his daughter Jane, though he tells Benjen that they are both Brandon's bastards by Ashara, even though the lie grates on him, and he tells Benjen that they will be coming to foster at Winterfell when they are 8. Benjen nods his acceptance and then tells him that he wishes to take the Black. Ned nods his acceptance, all the while crying inside, for it feels like his pack is breaking up all around him and there is nothing he can do to stop it from happening. He has been in Winterfell for a moon when his wife arrives. She arrives with their son, whom she informs him is called Robb, and he feels something beginning to bloom inside of him when he looks at his son's face. Something that feels akin to hope. Once she has been settled in and has been in Winterfell for a few days, he plucks up the courage one day to speak with her about the children in the south. He means to tell his wife the truth, but instead finds himself speaking the lie, and he hates himself for it. "My lady," he begins, his resolve beginning to falter as he watches Catelyn put her brush down and turn round to look at him. He swallows and goes on. "There is something you need to know." She remains silent. He swallows once more and goes on. "As much as it pains me to say this, Brandon was not faithful to your betrothal. He has 2 children with Ashara Dayne. They live in Starfall, a boy called Jon and a girl called Jane. I met them when I came back from the south. He hopes she will not ask him about his time in the south, for he does not think that he could bear to go on if she did." Catelyn merely looks at him before asking, "There is nothing more, is there, my lord?" He shakes his head and then says, "I asked for them to be sent here for fostering when they turn 8. I wish to know my brother's children. I hope that is okay with you, my lady." Catelyn smiles then and says, "Of course, my lord, it is only right." He smiles at her then, thankful that she has accepted what he has had to say without too much complaint. He receives updates on how his nephew and niece daughter are doing every moon, their progress written in Ashara's flowing handwriting that he knows so well from letters past, and he feels something like pain stab him, though he also feels guilt, knowing that they are being well looked after and cared for. He waits for the day when he can look them in the eye and welcome them to their home. As he watches his own children with Catelyn grow, he waits for the day when he can see them, all of them, at play. And he prays to the old gods that they never know the suffering that he and his siblings did. Ashara. She watches Eddard Stark ride out of Starfall with his companion, the Cranongman Howland Reed, and she feels like a part of her is being ripped apart inside. She knows it is for the best. It is for the best if Jon Targaryen becomes Jon Sand and grows up with his cousin sister Jane Sand, She knows it is better if the world thinks they are Brandon Stark's children. It will be much safer for Jon, and will at least mean that Jane knows something of her father, though of course Brandon Stark never laid with her at Harrenhal. No, he introduced her to his shyer, quieter and much less handsome brother Eddard Stark. At first she had been curious. She had danced with Ned for most of the night, and afterwards had invited him back to her room. He had of course declined, and that had only piqued her interest further. She spent the rest of the tournament pursuing him and trying to win him over, until finally the day before the jousting and the day before everything went to pot, she managed to finally break Ned's iron discipline, and she brought him to her bed. Oh, it had been a lovely feeling and sensation, though afterwards she had thought it just a one-time thing. But then he had slowly wormed his way into her heart. He wrote to her constantly, and at first she had only written back to him out of courtesy. But then she wrote to him simply because she wished to, and then because she couldn't go a day without writing to him, for he was always in her thoughts. And then she realized she was pregnant. Then she was worried, for Rickard and Brandon Stark had already been killed and the rebellion had already begun. She knew she could not write to him, for any ravens would be intercepted, and so she had maintained her silence throughout. And then when she heard that he had wed Catelyn Tully in his brother's place, she had wept, and only Elia's soothing words had managed to calm her. Arthur had escorted her back to Starfall before he had been sent with the Lord Commander to find Rhaegar, and so she had given birth in Starfall. She and Ned's daughter looked exactly like her, dark brown hair and violet eyes, but her smile, her persona was all Ned. She was a quiet baby, as was Jon. She watched as her daughter and her adopted son grew, and she felt herself swell with pride as she watched Jane and then Jon hot on her heels take their first steps together. She felt herself cry tears of happiness when both of their first words were mother. She watches as her children grow up close to her sister Illyria and her nephew Edric. She watches them play with each other. And then when they visit the water gardens, she watches them play with Doran and Oberyn's children, and she feels her heart swell with love. Alum, Doran, Oberyn and Illyria help, she thinks. Oberyn, it seems, is particularly understanding of the situation she finds herself in, though of course he knows not the truth of either of her child's parentage. Only Alum knows, and he knows not to speak of it openly. So she finds herself worrying when Oberyn tells her that Doran wishes to see her. Doran's illness has slowly been getting worse. It had been present before the rebellion, but since Elia's death and the subsequent uproar caused by it, his health had been slowly failing. But he still was an imposing man, and not one to underestimate despite what the Lannisters and Robert Baratheon might think. He was seated on a chair overlooking the water gardens and the children at play. Areo Hoda, his guard, stood in the shadows behind him. Ashara, it has been a long time since you played there, has it not? Yes, my prince, it has. I used to play there with Oberyn and Elia, she replied cautiously. Yes, so it has. Tell me, Ashara, have you thought about perhaps sending Jon to squire for Oberyn? It would be an invaluable experience, I'm sure. She swallows nervously before saying, whilst it would be an honor for Jon to squire for Oberyn, my prince, Jon will be going with Jane to Winterfell very soon to foster there and to get to know his cousins a bit better. Doran sighs and says, of course. Forgive me. I'm forgetting more and more with my old age. Very well then. I wish Jon and Jane the best. Thank you, my prince, she says as she bows and walks out. It feels like the years truly have flown by when she gets into the wheelhouse with Jane, Illyria and Edric, with Jon and Alum riding on horseback and Jane's sworn sword Arthur riding on horseback as well. Exactly 8 years to the day that she last saw Eddard Stark, and now she and her family ride to Winterfell so that Jon and Jane can be fostered there. She feels a pit of nerves beginning to grow in her stomach. She looks out of the wheelhouse to where Jon sits and he smiles at her. That cheeky smile that reminds her so much of Ned's smile, it almost breaks her heart. And then their journey begins. They stop off at various inns and keeps along the way to Winterfell. At one point they stop at the Twins and are greeted most hostilely by Walder Frey, who makes countless insults and poor-timed japes about Dornishmen and their promiscuity. Only Alum and Arthur's calming presence restrains Jon and Jane and Illyria from lashing out at the old man. When they leave the Twins to begin the journey north, Ashara makes sure to tell Alum to book passage on a ship for their return journey. Winterfell appears on the horizon 2 weeks after they set out from the Twins, and Ashara feels a lump begin to settle in her throat. This should have been hers, not Catelyn Tully's, all of it. But she can't think of that now. So instead she puts on a brave face and helps introduce herself and her family to the Starks of Winterfell. Ned is the same as ever, gruff and somber. His wife Catelyn Tully is all fiery red hair and beautiful. Robb Stark, the heir to Winterfell, looks like his mother except more masculine, and little Sansa Stark looks exactly like a miniature version of her mother. Arya Stark is the only one of the Stark children to look like Ned. Even at 2 she seems to be a fierce thing with lots of life. Ashara remembers another Stark girl who was also as fierce and how that ended with a bed of blood and a broken promise. She shakes the thoughts from her head to prevent them from taking root. She and Alum watch from the high table during the feast as Jon and Jane nervously speak with Robb and Theon Greyjoy, Ned's ward from the Greyjoy rebellion. Jane was born smaller than a normal baby and as such suffers from ill health. She is frail, just like Elia was, and just like Elia, she has a brother who is fiercely protective of her. Jon nearly hits Theon Greyjoy in the nose when the boy says something about Jane's frail health, and she and Alum share a knowing look, though she can tell from the expression on Ned's face that some memory must have been stirred up at the scene. Overall, their time in Winterfell is pleasant, albeit a little awkward, for the North and Dorne will never truly recover from what Rhaegar and Lyanna Stark did. Though before she leaves her children for what could possibly be the last time, she speaks with Jon the night before they are set to leave. "You wanted to see me, Mama?" Jon asks, and Ashara can tell he is impatient to go off and play with Robb and Theon. She smiles then and brushes back a loose curl from his forehead. "Yes, I did, Jon." She pauses and then takes a deep breath before going on. "I just want you to know how proud I am of you and of Jane. I know that this might seem very scary, but I want you to know that you will be fine, and if you ever need anything, I am only a raven's letter away, and I will come." Jon looks at her through his curls, and she can swear she sees a little of the Targaryen in his eyes. They seem momentarily purple in the light. She continues, "I want you and Jane to look after each other, okay? Don't leave each other alone. You are strongest when together, okay, sweetling?" Jon nods and says, "Okay, Mama." She smiles and kisses him on his brow and then says, "Good night, Jon." The next day she, Alum, Illyria and Edric ride back for Starfall, leaving Jon, Jane and Arthur behind. Varys. He had been in King's Landing for nigh on 20 years now. He had first come to King's Landing to serve King Aerys II, after Duskendale Aerys had been convinced that his own shadow was out to get him, and so having heard of a man across the narrow sea with a penchant for gathering secrets and information had him sent for. And so Varys had arrived in King's Landing, the capital city of Westeros, all those years ago and had set to work. It had taken him some time to get into the king's good graces, but once he had Aerys listened to his whispers and counsel more frequently than he did his own hand, the mighty Tywin Lannister. It had been on Varys' suggestion that Aerys had married Prince Rhaegar to Elia Martell, the better to strengthen ties to a kingdom that had been part of the royal family before. Of course Varys could not have foreseen how frail and sickly Princess Elia truly was. She only managed to give Prince Rhaegar 2 children, and Prince Aegon was born during his father's absence from the capital, whilst he was away with the Stark girl. Rhaegar died on the Trident and Aerys panicked. He refused to send Princess Elia and her children to Dorne where they would be safe. Instead he kept them close by as hostages, and when Tywin Lannister was knocking on the gates, for the first time since Varys had been in his service, Aerys ignored his advice and followed the advice of that turncoat Pycelle and opened the gates, and of course the rest, as they say, is history. Tywin Lannister sacked the city, and had his men butcher Princess Elia and Princess Rhaenys. The man and the rest of Westeros believed that Prince Aegon had been killed by Gregor Clegane, but Varys knew that was a lie, for when news of the Trident had reached the city, Princess Elia had come and found him and begged him to protect her son, and so he found a pisswater prince in the slums of Flea Bottom and bought him from his father for a jug of Arbor gold, and then brought that pisswater prince into the Red Keep and had Aegon smuggled across the narrow sea with Varys' own sister to Pentos and to a waiting Illyrio Mopatis. He had of course been pardoned by King Robert when he ascended the throne, along with the Kingslayer and Ser Barristan Selmy and Pycelle, though if Varys had had his way Pycelle would be rotting on a spike on the walls of the Red Keep. With a new reign had come new players, Tywin Lannister happy now that his daughter was queen and that his grandson would be king returned to the Rock. Robert Baratheon made Jon Arryn his hand, and with Jon Arryn soon came Peter Baelish. Now Jon Arryn epitomized his house words, He carried out his dealings honorably and without a hint of deceit. He skillfully managed to negotiate a peace with Dorne when they were calling for blood. But he lacked the skills to effectively play the game, and for that he was paying the price. Baelish, the man, was cunning by half and smart as well. He knew the game and how to play it. He was carrying out an illicit affair with the hand's wife right under the man's nose, and kept Jon Arryn none the wiser. Cersei Baratheon was more Lannister than ever. She played the game well but had little patience to truly nurture the seeds that she planted, and for that she would be found out and dealt with in due time. When word reached him through his little birds that Jon Arryn and Stannis Baratheon had been seen walking the streets of King's Landing together, he knew that they were discovering the truth of Cersei's children's heritage, that they were in fact the Kingslayers and not Robert's. Varys had found out the truth long ago. When Princess Myrcella came out with the same golden locks as her mother, Pycelle knew, of course. But the man was so deep in Tywin Lannister's pockets that he would never, ever say a word to Robert. Baelish found out later, of course, but also said nothing to Robert or to Jon Arryn about it, to suit his own ends. And Varys, he did not tell Robert Baratheon the truth. For what good would the word of a former Targaryen loyalist do to prove anything against the Queen and the might of Casterly Rock? No, he laid subtle hints along the way for Jon Arryn and Stannis Baratheon to follow and to find. It was he who suggested that he read a book by Maester Mullion about the lineages of the great houses, knowing that he would find the confirmation that he was looking for. Then the man fell ill, and Varys suspected that perhaps Cersei Lannister had played her hand early. It made no matter, he would adjust his plans. If war was to come, he would be ready. He would make sure the rightful king was ready. He kept an eye on Viserys and Daenerys. They may have wandered across the free cities no better than common beggars, but Varys always made sure that they had food and shelter, and that the hired assassins that Robert sent after them always entered the city after they had left. He knew it was too risky to have them meet with Aegon whilst Viserys was still alive, for the innocent boy whom Varys remembered from King's Landing had become mad, insanely mad during his time in exile, and would more than likely kill his nephew, so Varys was determined that Viserys had to die before Aegon could meet the rest of his family. He had also been keeping an eye on Dorne since the rebellion. He knew that that kingdom still seethed with the injustice. Prince Oberyn had tried to get Dorne to rise up in rebellion for Prince Viserys, but his older brother Prince Doran had a cooler head and had prevailed. It had been Prince Doran and not Prince Oberyn who had negotiated the peace with Jon Arryn, though it had been Prince Oberyn who had gone to Braavos to negotiate a marriage pact between Viserys and Arianne Martell. Varys knew this, and yet he kept it close to his chest. It would do no good for Robert to know. The man hungered for war. He had not fought a battle since the Greyjoy rebellion and yet still mourned his lady Lyanna. He had become a shadow of the man he had been during the rebellion, and yet Varys knew that the man had to die, but not too soon, if Aegon was to ever reclaim the throne, for Robert had the undying loyalty of the North, and with it the Riverlands and the Vale. Joffrey, however, did not. The summer snows were falling in Winterfell, had been falling for some days now. Robb did not truly mind. After all, it gave him something else to think about other than his upcoming nuptials. It was not that he did not like Alice Karstark. He liked her well enough. She was pretty and she was funny. It was just that he knew that this was sign that he was becoming a man, and he was not so sure he was ready to give up on his childhood just yet. He heard a knock on the door and said for whoever it was to come in. His cousin Jon entered the room. Robb smiled at him. Since Jon had arrived with his sister Jane at the age of 8, the three of them had become quite close. Robb had enjoyed having a boy his own age to play with, had enjoyed trading japes and stories with Jon and Theon, and had been happy that Sansa had someone to play with and follow as well in Jane. Of course, Sansa had turned into a right little lady since those days and now spent most of her time sewing and doing other ladylike pursuits with Septa Mordain, and so it had fallen to Arya to take to following he, Jon, and Theon around. Jane, because of her frail health, spent most of the time with Sansa sewing, though Robb knew she hated it. "You look grim, Stark. Come on, I'm sure Lady Alice isn't that bad," Jon said. "Ah, Sand, you don't know the half of it," Robb joked. He saw Jon give one of his rare smiles, and heard him reply, "Are you nervous, Robb?" Robb said. It was true, he was very nervous. Jon grinned at him then, and he knew some jape was about to come out of his cousin's mouth. "Well, you shouldn't be. All that time you spent with her the last time she was here. I think you're both more than knowledgeable of what you'll have to do when the time comes." Robb blushed and cursed at his cousin, causing Jon to laugh uproariously. Once Jon had finished laughing, he turned serious and asked, "But seriously, how are you doing?" Robb smiled. It was just like Jon to worry about others, putting everyone else's concerns before his own. "I'm good, Jon, truly I am. How's Jane doing?" Jane had fallen ill a few days past, and they were worried that she might not be able to attend the wedding, or worse, she might not even be able to get out of bed in time for when her and Jon's mother came to visit. Robb saw Jon's body tense, as it so often did when talk turned to Jane. His cousin was very, very protective of his sister. Robb remembered once when they had been no older than Arya was now. Jon had broken some stable boy's jaw, because the stable boy had made a joke about Jane's frail health. The boy had been dismissed from Winterfell, and Jon had been reprimanded by Robb's father and mother, though secretly Robb knew that they both approved of what Jon had done. Jon sighed. "She's getting better. This illness was harder on her than it should have been. Luwin says that she should be fine and should be up and about in time for the wedding though." Robb smiled reassuringly at Jon. "That's good then, isn't it?" Jon merely grunted. "I hope so, or I may need to have words with Luwin." They both shared a laugh at that, though they both knew that if something did happen to Jane, Jon would be distraught and would more than likely blame himself for it, even though it wouldn't be his fault. The day of the wedding dawned bright and early. The whole of the north had come to see the son of the Ned marry, and so Winterfell was filled to bursting. The Karstarks had been the first to arrive, of course. Alice, Robb's betrothed, had simply glided into the great hall, and Robb had felt himself growing oddly flustered in her presence, something that had caused Jon and Theon to jape about constantly. Since. Next had come the Umbers, the giants of Last Hearth, bellowing about this and that. Then had come the Boltons, Roose and his household. His bastard was not welcome. Then the Hornwoods, the Manderleys, the Serwyns, and the mountain clans. The last to come from Dorne, Jon and Jane's mother, Lady Ashara, with their cousin Edric Dayne, the new lord of Starfall. Robb was stood by the heart tree in the godswood dressed in his house colors of grey, when he saw Alice walking in on the arm of her father, the gruff Rickard Karstark. She looked lovely, truly she did, and Robb felt the nerves begin to grow within him. Soon he would be a married man. As her father led her up to the heart tree and left her to stand beside him, she flashed him a warm smile that Robb returned. Then they both turned to face the heart tree and Robb's father. Lord Eddard was a solemn man by nature, though he loved his children and his niece and nephew dearly, and the pride in his voice could be heard as he began the wedding prayer. "We are gathered here today to witness the uniting of two people, to see them bonded in the oldest and purest of traditions. If there is any here who believe that this union should not happen, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." A moment's silence. Then Lord Eddard went on. "Who comes?" Rickard Karstark stepped forward then and said, "Alice of House Karstark." "Who claims her?" Robb stood forward and in as bold a voice as he could manage said, "Robb of House Stark comes to claim her." Lord Eddard turned to them both then and said, "Marriage is a sacred bond between a man and his wife. Do you both swear to love and care for each other, to protect each other to the best of your abilities from this day, till the day you die?" "I do," they said in unison. "Do you swear it by ice? Do you swear it by fire? Do you swear it by the old gods and the new?" "I do," they replied. "Then I pronounce you man and wife. You may kiss." Robb leaned down and brought Alice's face closer to his, and then brought his lips to hers. It was not the first time they had kissed, but it was the first time that they could do so in the open, and so Robb couldn't help it if he held the kiss for longer than perhaps was strictly appropriate, drawing many catcalls and wolf whistles from some of the young men in attendance. They broke apart after a space, and then led the party back into the hall for the wedding feast, and then the bedding to come. Bran. The morning dawned clear and cold, with a crispness that hinted at the end of summer. They set forth at daybreak to see a man beheaded, 20 in all, and Bran rode among them, nervous with excitement. This was the first time he had been deemed old enough to go with his lord father and his brother and cousin to see the king's justice done. It was the 9th year of summer, and the 7th of Bran's life. The man had been taken outside a small holdfast in the hills. Robb thought he was a wildling, his sword sworn to Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall. It made Bran's skin prickle to think of it. He remembered the hearth tales old Nan told them. The wildlings were cruel men, she said, slavers and slayers and thieves. They consorted with giants and ghouls, stole girl children in the dead of night, and drank blood from polished horns. And their women lay with the others in the long night to sire terrible half-human children. But the man they found bound hand and foot to the holdfast wall awaiting the king's justice was old and scrawny, not much taller than Robb. He had lost both ears and a finger to frostbite, and he dressed all in black, the same as a brother of the Night's Watch, except that his furs were ragged and greasy. The breath of man and horse mingled, steaming, in the cold morning air as his lord father had the man cut down from the wall and dragged before them. Robb and Jon sat tall and still on their horses, with Bran between them on his pony, trying to seem older than 7, trying to pretend he'd seen all this before. A faint wind blew through the holdfast gate. Over their heads flapped the banner of the Starks of Winterfell, a gray direwolf racing across an ice-white field. Bran's father sat solemnly on his horse, long brown hair stirring in the wind. His closely trimmed beard was shot with white, making him seem older than his 35 years. He had a grim cast to his gray eyes this day, and he seemed not at all the man who would sit before the fire in the evening and talk softly of the age of heroes and the children of the forest. He had taken father's face off, Bran thought, and donned the face of Lord Stark of Winterfell. There were questions asked and answers given there in the chill of morning, but afterward Bran could not recall much of what had been said. Finally, his lord father gave a command and 2 of his guardsmen dragged the ragged man to the ironwood stump in the center of the square. They forced his head down onto the hard black wood. Lord Eddard Stark dismounted and his ward Theon Greyjoy brought forth the sword. Ice that sword was called. It was as wide across as a man's hand and taller even than Robb. The blade was Valyrian steel, spell-forged and dark as smoke. Nothing held an edge like Valyrian steel. His father peeled off his gloves and handed them to Jory Castle, the captain of his household guard. He took hold of ice with both hands and said, "In the name of Robert of the House Baratheon, the first of his name, king of the Undulls and the Rhoynar and the First Men, lord of the 7 kingdoms and protector of the realm, by the word of Eddard of the House Stark, lord of Winterfell and warden of the North, I do sentence you to die." He lifted the great sword high above his head. Bran's cousin Jon Sand moved closer. "Keep the pony well in hand," he whispered, "and don't look away. Uncle Ned will know if you do." Bran kept his pony well in hand and did not look away. His father took the man's head off with a single sure stroke. Blood sprayed out across the snow, as red as summer wine. One of the horses reared and had to be restrained to keep from bolting. Bran could not take his eyes off the blood. The snows around the stump drank it eagerly, reddening as he watched. Later, as they rode back to Winterfell through the woods, Bran found himself speaking with his cousin Jon. "Do you still wish to take the Black John?" Knowing that that man spoke of whites and others, he shivered involuntarily. His cousin chuckled and said, "Yes, Bran, I still wish to take the Black. There is honor in serving the Night's Watch, and besides the man was a deserter and delusional. There are no whites and no White Walkers." With that Bran watched as his cousin spurred his horse forward and raced after Robb and Theon Greyjoy. He was so deep in thought that he did not hear the rest of the party ride up until his father moved up beside him. "Are you well, Bran?" he asked, not unkindly. "Yes, father," Bran told him. He looked up, wrapped in his furs and leathers on his great warhorse. His lord father looked like a giant. "Robb says the man died bravely, but Jon says he was afraid." "What do you think?" his father asked. Bran thought about it for a moment, then asked, "Can a man still be brave if he is afraid?" "That is the only time a man can be brave," was his father's solemn response. They saw Jon riding up fast toward them. He stopped his horse just short of them and said, "Bran, Uncle, come quickly. You have to see what we've found." And so they followed Jon, riding until they were deep into the forest, the rest of the party following them. And there deep in the forest, they found Robb and Theon standing over a creature that looked like a wolf, but was bigger than any wolf Bran had ever seen before, and it had a stag's antler jutting through its chest. Bran tore his gaze away from the creature and gave a cry of delight when he saw the bundle in Robb's arms. "Go on," Robb told him. "You can touch him." Arguments soon broke out when Bran's Lord Father came, mutterings of how strange it was to see a dire wolf south of the wall, of how the bitch had whelped pups. But whether or not the pups would survive or not was never truly discussed, until Theon tried to yank the pup Bran had in his hand out of his hand. Jon spoke then, "Lord Stark." It was strange to hear call Father that, so formal. "There are 5 pups," he told Father. 3 male, 2 female. "What of it, Jon?" "You have 5 children," Jon said. 3 sons, 2 daughters. The dire wolf is the sigil of your house. Your children were meant to have these pups, my lord. Lord Eddard regarded Jon thoughtfully. Robb rushed into the silence he left. "I will nurse him myself, Father," he promised. "I will soak a towel with warm milk and give him suck from that." "Me too," echoed Bran. The Lord weighed his sons long and carefully with his eyes. "Easy to say and harder to do. I will not have you wasting the servants' time with this. If you want these pups, you will feed them yourselves. Is that understood?" Bran nodded eagerly. The pup squirmed in his grasp, licked at his face with a warm tongue. "You must train them as well," their father said. "You must train them. The kennel master will have nothing to do with these monsters, I promise you that. And the gods help you if you neglect them, or brutalize them, or train them badly. These are not dogs to beg for treats and slink off at a kick. A dire wolf will rip a man's arm off his shoulders as easily as a dog will kill a rat. Are you sure you want this?" "Yes, Father," Bran said. "Yes," Robb agreed. "The pups may die anyway, despite all you do." "They won't die," Robb said. "We won't let them die. Keep them then. Jory, Desmond, gather up the other pups. It's time we were back to Winterfell." It was not until they were mounted and on their way that Bran allowed himself to taste the sweet air of victory. By then, his pup was snuggled inside his leathers, warm against him, safe for the long ride home. Bran was wondering what to name him. Halfway across the bridge, Jon pulled up suddenly. "What is it, Jon?" Bran's Lord Father asked. "Can't you hear it?" Bran could hear the wind in the trees, the clatter of their hooves on the ironwood planks, the whimpering of his hungry pup, but Jon was listening to something else. "There," Jon said. He swung his horse around and galloped back across the bridge. They watched him dismount where the dire wolf lay dead in the snow, watched him kneel. A moment later he was riding back to them smiling. "They must have crawled away from the others," Jon said. "Or been driven away," Bran's father said, looking at the 2 dire wolf pups. One's fur was white. His eyes were as red as the blood of the ragged man who had died that morning. The other was a sandy yellow color, with eyes that were as black as midnight. Bran thought it curious that these pups alone would have opened their eyes while the others were still blind. "An albino and a sickly pup," Theon said with wry amusement. "They'll die even faster than the others." Jon gave the ward a long, chilling look. "I think not, Greyjoy," he said. "They belong to me and Jane. Catelyn." Catelyn watched from the yard as her children and her niece and nephew played with their wolves. The boys had come back from the execution not as grim nor as quiet as she had come to expect. The reason for that she had soon found out. They had brought direwolf pups back with them. According to Maester Luwin, these were the first direwolves to be seen south of the wall in nigh on 200 years. The children's excitement had been a joy to behold. They had each quickly chosen a direwolf. Robb's Grey Wind was as grey as his name suggested. Sansa had called hers Lady. Arya named hers Nymeria after the warrior queen, earning a smile from Lady Ashara. Bran was still unsure what to name his and was going through various names and trying to find the right one. Rickon had named his shaggy dog. Jon had named his albino direwolf Ghost, and Jane had named her sandy-colored direwolf Sandy. She watched her children play with their cousins. Next to her, Lady Ashara, Jon and Jane's mother sat and watched them play as well. Ashara had come with her nephew for Robb's wedding to Alice Karstark a week past. She had only been to Winterfell once before, 6 years ago, to leave Jon and Jane in Winterfell for fostering, though of course no date had been set for when the children would return to Starfall. Catelyn did not mind the children's presence in Winterfell. For one thing, she thought that it was good that her own children knew their cousins. For another, it was good that they had someone to play with other than each other, though she could not help but think of Jon and think of what she had heard of Ramsay Snow, Lord Bolton's bastard, who had, it was rumored, killed his own true-born brother Domeric a few years ago. She knew that perhaps she was being irrational and unfair to Jon, for he was a good lad, nice and kind, but she could not stop the fear that perhaps one day when he got older he would try and claim Winterfell from Robb. After all, he was older than Robb by a few months, and Brandon had been the older sibling. She was taken from her thoughts when one of the helpers gave her a letter. She noticed that it bore the royal sigil. Curious as to what it could be, she broke the letter open and read it quickly. She glanced at her children playing the courtyard and then excused herself from Lady Ashara's company and made her way to the Godswood. Ned would need to know of the news that had come. She had never truly liked the Godswood. She had been born at Tully at Riverrun, far to the south, on the Red Fork of the Trident. The Godswood, there was a garden, bright and airy, where tall redwoods spread dappled shadows across twinkling streams. Birds sang from hidden nests, and the air was spicy with the scent of flowers. The gods of Winterfell kept a different sort of wood. It was a dark, primal place, 3 acres of old forest untouched for 10,000 years. As the gloomy castle rose around it, it smelled of moist earth and decay. No redwoods grew here. This was a wood of stubborn sentinel trees armored in gray-green needles of might oaks of ironwoods as old as the realm itself. Here thick black trunks crowded close together while twisted branches wove dense canopy overhead and misshapen roots wrestled beneath the soil. This was a place of deep silence and brooding shadows, and the gods who lived here had no names. But she knew she would find her husband here tonight. Whenever he took a man's life, he would seek the quiet of the Godswood. Sure enough, she found him sitting on a rock facing the heart tree, cleaning ice with a wet cloth and brush. When he noticed her presence, they talked for a while about other things, such as how well Bran had done during the execution, about the children and their direwolves, and how they would soon need begin preparing the harvest, for winter was soon to come. They also spoke about Jon and Jane, and how Jon wished to take the black, and how Ashara and Jane were trying to convince him otherwise, though little reward. Once that was done, Catelyn breached the actual reason for her visit to a place she did not often care for. She took her husband's hand. "There was grievous news today, my lord. I did not wish to trouble you until you had cleansed yourself." There was no way to soften the blow, so she told him straight. "I am so sorry, my love. Jon Arryn is dead." His eyes found hers, and she could see how hard it took him, as she had known it would. In his youth, Ned had fostered at the Eyrie, and the childless Lord Arryn had become a second father him and his fellow ward, Robert Baratheon. When the Mad King Aerys II Targaryen had demanded their heads, the Lord of the Eyrie had raised his moon and falcon banners in revolt rather than give up those he had pledged to protect. And one day 15 years ago, this second father had become a brother as well, as he and Ned stood together in the sept at Riverrun to wed 2 sisters, the daughters of Lord Hoster Tully. "Jon," he said, "is this news certain?" "It was the king's own seal, and the letter is in Robert's own hand. I saved it for you," he said. Lord Arryn was taken quickly. Even Maester Pycelle was helpless, but he brought the milk of the poppy, so Jon did not linger for long in pain. "That is some small mercy, I suppose," he said. She could see the grief on his face, but even he thought of her first. "Your sister and Jon's boy, what word of them?" The message said only that they were well and had returned to the Eyrie. "I wish they had gone to Riverrun instead. The Eyrie is high and lonely, and it was ever her husband's place, not hers. Lord Jon's memory will haunt each stone. I know my sister. She needs the comfort of family and friends around her. Your uncle waits in the Vale, does he not? Jon named him Knight of the Gate. I'd heard." Catelyn nodded. "Brynden will do what he can for her, and for the boy. That is some comfort, but still." "Go to her," Ned urged. "Take the children. fill her halls with noise and shouts and laughter. That boy of hers needs other children about him, and Lisa should not be alone in her grief. Would that I could, she said. The letter had other tidings. The king is riding to Winterfell to seek you out. It took Ned a moment to comprehend her words, but when the understanding came, the darkness left his eyes. Robert is coming here? When she nodded, a smile broke across his face. Catelyn wished she could share his joy, but she had heard the talk in the yards. A dire wolf dead in the snow, a broken antler in its chest. Dread coiled in her like a snake, but she forced herself to smile. This man she loved put no faith in signs. I knew that would please you, she said. We should send word to your brother on the wall, and ask Ashara to stay for a little while longer. Yes, of course, he agreed. Ben will want to be here. I shall tell Maester Luwin to send his swiftest bird. Ned rose and pulled her to her feet. Damnation! How many years has it been? And he gives us no more notice than this? How many in his party? Did the message say? I should think 100 knights, at least with all their retainers, and half again as many freeriders. Cersei and the children travel with them. Robert will keep an easy pace for their sakes, he said. It is just as well. That will give us more time to prepare. The Queen's brothers are also in the party, she told him. Ned grimaced at that. There was small love between him and the Lannisters, and of course with Ashara here there would be tension because of her connection with Princess Elia. Well, if the price for Robert's company is an infestation of Lannisters, so be it. It sounds as though Robert is bringing half his court. Where the king goes the realm follows, she said. I just hope he does nothing untoward to provoke Ashara. She does not like him, nor does he like the Dornish. Ned said, worried for a moment. I will speak with her if you wish. Catelyn said, knowing that he would agree. She got on well with Jon and Jane's mother. Very well then, Ned replied. Jane. It was a relatively warm day in Winterfell, well as warm as it could get with the summer snows. Even so, Jane wrapped up in several layers just to make sure she did not catch a chill or another illness. She had been bedridden for several days before her cousin Rob's wedding, and had only just recovered in time to greet her mother when she arrived with cousin Edric. She had always been frail, that was what the maesters called it. She feel ill easily. She caught colds easily. It was quite a pain if she was honest, and it often led. She knew to some whispering by the servants and helpers when they thought she could not hear them. But Jane had heard most of what the whispers said, that it would be better if she simply went off and died, went to sleep and never woke up again, that if that were to happen it would make life so much easier for her family. Jane had never truly heard the whispers. She doubted whether there had been any whispers, when she had lived in Starfall. No, the helpers there were too loyal to her Uncle Alum and her and Jon's mother, and still remembered Princess Elia to make any comment about their lady's daughter's ill health. Winterfell was different. She had never truly fit in the north, and it was not for lack of trying. She got on well with her cousins, but the cold weather just seemed to disagree with her, and more often than not she found herself bedridden with some illness or the other. She had been 8 and newly arrived to Winterfell when she had heard some of the maids whispering about her ill health. They had said some very nasty things about her, and that had made her run to her room and cry her eyes out. She had not come out of her room for hours, and eventually it had taken both her brother Jon and her sworn sword Arthur to coerce her out of her room. She had later spoken to Uncle Ned about it, and he had told her that should she hear anything like that again, she was to come and tell him straight away and he would deal with it. Of course she had come to him once to tell him, but as she had gotten older, though the whispers still followed her around, she simply developed a thick skin and ignored what the whispers said. Let them whisper was what she often thought. The whisperers simply had nothing better to occupy their time with, and really she felt sorry for them. Of course Rob and Jon did not seem to share her attitude toward the whispers. Jon more so than Rob, and she knew there had been times where they had got into fights with some of the local stable boys or other boys about comments they had made about her. But that was all in the past now. Her mother was here, and she knew that she would finally get to return home back to Starfall. She knew that she would miss her cousins, but she would keep in contact with them through letters. The only problem was that Jon wished to join the Night's Watch. When he had told her, she had nodded and accepted his reasons, but internally she had felt like crying. Jon was her brother. They had grown up together. They'd done pretty much everything together. She did not know what she would do without him, and so she had devised a plan to convince Jon to change his mind. She had worked with Robb and his wife Alice, and then when her mother had come she had told her about her plan, and now days before the king was to come to Winterfell, she was about to put her plan in motion. She heard a knock on the door, and from the way Sandy ran and began scratching at the door she knew that it would be her mother. She went and opened the door. Lady Ashara, Jon and Jane's mother, had been a beauty when she had been younger. With dark hair and haunting violet eyes she had captured the attention of many men. Even now, older as she was, she still caused heads to turn. Many marriage proposals Jane knew had come to Starfall asking for her mother's hand. But Lady Ashara had turned each and every one of them down. Why, Jane knew not, but she was glad. She did not wish to have to share her mother with anyone other than Jon. Robb and Alice soon entered her room as well, Grey Wind padding in and instantly beginning to play with Sandy. All they needed to do now was wait. There was a comfortable silence for a few minutes before they heard footsteps approaching her room. And she could tell that it was Jon, and so she went and opened the door before he had even had a chance to knock. Ghost bounded in and began playing with Sandy and Grey Wind. Jon walked into her room looking confused when he saw their mother and Robb and Alice in the room. "You wanted to see me, Jane?" Jon asked, his confusion evident. "Yes, well actually we all wanted to see you. We've got something we want to speak to you about," Jane replied. "Okay," Jon said hesitantly. Jane swallowed nervously and then began. "I know you want to join the Night's Watch, Jon, but have you thought about other places for you to go to? Other things for you to do?" She saw Jon begin to reply, his mouth tightening as it often did when he became angry. Jane went on, "I know this might be selfish of me, Jon, but I don't want you to go to the Wall. We've always been there for each other growing up, and I don't know, I'd feel lost without you beside me. Who's going to be there to make me laugh when I fall ill? Who's going to sing to me at night?" "Jane, Jon began, but Robb interrupted him. "Jon, you know you can always stay in Winterfell for a bit longer. You don't have to go to the Wall or even back south for a little while. You've still got time, cuz," Alice elaborated. "Besides, I'm going to need some help keeping Robb in line, if King Robert does decided to take your father down south with him." She smiled at that, and Jane could have kissed her. Jon still looked hesitant and vaguely bemused. He turned to look at their mother to see what she had to say. "I know you wish to join the Night's Watch, Jon, but surely you can do that in a few years' time. The Wall has stood for 8,000 years, and will continue to stand. Experience a bit more of life, Jon. Come back home, see Starfall. See Illyria before she goes off and marries Lord Beric. Meet Princess Arianne and the Sand Snakes one more time, and then if you still want to take the Black." Jane knew they had nearly convinced Jon to change his mind, but then she saw the way his shoulders straightened and the way he stood taller, and she knew they had lost. Jon was decided. "I know that you all want what is best for me, and I thank you for that. But for once in my life I just want to do something because I want to do it, not because I've been told to do it. There is honor in serving in the Night's Watch. A man can rise high in the Watch no matter his name or station of birth. I think that I can fulfill myself in the Watch, and besides," he said, a wry smile coming onto his face then, "black always has been my color." They all laughed at that, but Jane could not help the feeling of sadness that began to engulf her. Jon, her brother, her companion, would be leaving Winterfell, but he would not be heading south with her and their mother. No, he would be heading north to the Wall. As if sensing her distress, Sandy began to whine. Before anyone else could say anything, though, there was a knock on the door and one of the servants poked their head round the door to inform them that their presence was required down in the courtyard, for the king's party had been spotted on the horizon. Robb and Alice bid them farewell and headed out of the room toward the courtyard, Grey Wind on their heels, leaving Jane, Jon, and their mother in the room. Lady Ashara looked at Jon and quietly asked him, "Are you sure this is what you wish to do, Jon?" Jane watched as her brother nodded. She heard her mother sigh then and say, "Very well. I will not force you to change your mind. But know that if you ever do change your mind, Starfall will wait for you. Now come. Let us greet the baby-killing king and his whore of a queen. Will you be okay, mother? Greeting King Robert and Queen Cersei." Jane asked. Both she and Jon knew their mother had a very low opinion of Robert Baratheon and the Lannisters because of what they had done to her friend Princess Elia and her children Rhaenys and Aegon. Jane heard her mother give a bitter laugh. Yes, sweetling, I will be fine. With you and Jon here, I have no cause for complaint. So long as I don't have to look to long the royals, I shall be fine. She smiled then, and then Jane, Jon and their mother walked down to the courtyard arm in arm to wait for the royal party. Because of their mother's presence, Jane knew that she and Jon would be standing in the front line with their cousins and their Uncle Ned and Aunt Catelyn. Otherwise, they would likely be standing with Theon Greyjoy. Jane shuddered at the very thought of it. There was something about Theon that creeped her out. She stood next to her mother and her brother as they waited for the king's party to ride through the gates. They waited for a long moment, and then the royal party burst through the gates of Winterfell in a flurry of gold, silver, and crimson, Lannister crimson. Jane spotted the Kingslayer, Jaime Lannister, wearing golden armor. She briefly wondered if it was the same armor he had worn when he had killed the king he had been sworn to protect. Next came a man with a face so burned it was horrible to look upon, and beside him rode a boy who could only be the crown prince. He had golden Lannister hair, it curled down to his shoulders, and he wore an expression of absolute disdain. Jane already felt the hate pooling in her gut at the sight of him, and knew from the way Jon tensed beside her that he felt the same. She reached and grabbed his hand and squeezed it tightly. Next came a big fat man, with long black hair and a thick black beard to hide his many chins and loose skin. He vaulted off his warhorse and strode toward Uncle Ned and soon had him in a bone-crushing hug. "Ned!" she heard the man exclaim, belatedly realizing that this man was the king, Robert Baratheon, her uncle's oldest friend. "You have not changed at all." "Your Grace," Jane heard her uncle say in his lord's voice, "Winterfell is yours." Jane then heard the king say, "Take me down to your crypts, Ned. I would pay my respects." Just as his queen, the Lannister woman, dismounted and walked toward him and her uncle. She tried to voice her protests about the long journey, but the king ignored her and merely gestured for her Uncle Ned to lead the way. Once they had disappeared out of sight, it had fallen to her Aunt Catelyn to introduce the queen to the rest of them. When Queen Cersei got to herself, her mother and Jon, she gave the three of them a rather cold look before turning her face up at them in a dismissive manner and walking on. As the guests were shown to their accommodations, Jane heard Jon whisper in her ear, loud enough only for their mother to hear, "Well, that certainly was disappointing, and the queen seems full of herself." Jane had to hide her smile behind her hand, and she knew her mother was doing the same. It truly had not been what she was expecting. Eddard. They went down to the crypt together, Ned and the king he scarcely recognized. The winding stone steps were narrow. Ned went first with the lantern. "I was starting to think we would never reach Winterfell," Robert complained as they descended. "In the south, the way they talk about my 7 kingdoms, a man forgets that your part is as big as the other 6 combined." "I trust you enjoyed the journey, Your Grace?" Robert snorted. "Bogs and forests and fields, and scarcely a decent inn north of the neck. I've never seen such a vast emptiness. Where are all your people?" "Likely they were too shy to come out," Ned jested. He could feel the chill coming up the stairs, a cold breath from deep within the earth. "Kings are a rare sight in the north." Robert snorted. "More likely they were hiding under the snow." "Snow, Ned." The king put one hand on the wall to steady himself as they descended. "Late summer snows are common enough," Ned said. "I hope they did not trouble you. They are usually mild." "The others take your mild snows," Robert swore. "What will this place be like in winter? I shudder to think." "The winters are hard," Ned admitted, "but the Starks will endure. We always have." "You need to come south," Robert told him. "You need a taste of summer before it flees. In Highgarden, there are fields of golden roses that stretch away as far as the eye can see. The fruits are so ripe they explode in your mouth. You will see I brought you some. Even at Storm's End, with that good wind off the bay, the days are so hot you can barely move. And you ought to see the towns, Ned. Flowers everywhere, the markets bursting with food, the summeriness so cheap and so good that you can get drunk just breathing the air. Everyone is fat and drunk and rich." He laughed and slapped his own ample stomach a thump. "And the girls, Ned!" he exclaimed, his eyes sparkling. "I swear, women lose all modesty in the heat. They swim naked in the river, right beneath the castle. Even in the streets, it's too damn hot for wool or fur, so they go around in these short gowns. Silk if they have the silver and cotton if not, but it's all the same when they start sweating and the cloth sticks to their skin. They might as well be naked." The king laughed happily. Robert Baratheon had always been a man of huge appetites, a man who knew how to take his pleasures. That was not a charge anyone could lay at the door of Eddard Stark. Yet Ned could not help but notice that those pleasures were taking a toll on the king. Robert was breathing heavily by the time they reached the bottom of the stairs, his face red in the lantern light as they stepped out into the darkness of the crypt. He swept the lantern in a wide semicircle. Shadows moved and lurched. Flickering light touched the stones underfoot and brushed against a long procession of granite pillars that marched ahead, 2 by 2 in the dark. Between the pillars, the dead sat on their stone thrones against the walls, backs against the sepulchres that contained their mortal remains. He led Robert past the dead of House Stark, past lords of Winterfell, their likeness carved into the stone tombs that encased them, their swords gripped in an iron grip over their laps and direwolves of their house curled at their feet. He stopped when he reached the place where his sister's statue stood. A garland of pale blue roses were tucked at her feet. Ned had placed them there when he had last visited a few days prior to the king's arrival. They stood in a contemplative silence for a long moment before Robert began speaking about times past, reminiscing about times that had been and things that should have happened. Most of all, though, his old friend spoke of Lyanna and Rhaegar. He spoke lovingly of Lyanna, and venom dripped from him as he spoke of Prince Rhaegar. Ned did not wish to think too long on that topic, for he knew that the product of their union was in the hall above them. He also knew that buried deep down with Lyanna's bones was the wedding cloak that she had been given by the prince, a cloak of Targaryen black with the red three-headed dragon on it. Once Robert had finished reminiscing, they stood in silence once more for a long time. Ned thought briefly that Robert may have fallen asleep, so quiet he was. But then he broke the silence and spoke once more, but in a quieter voice. "So Ned, what is it like having the Lady Ashara in Winterfell?" Ned turned to face his friend, keeping his expression blank. "What do you mean, Robert?" Robert chuckled. "Oh, come now, Ned. I know you fancied her back when we were boys. Tell me, is she still as beautiful as she was at Harrenhal? Have you tried bringing her to yours and Catelyn's bed? I hear Dornish women are more than willing to try that sort of thing." Ned swallowed. He was horrified by what his friend was suggesting. He had slept with Ashara once, at Harrenhal, and their daughter believed that his brother Brandon was her father, to better protect Jon. The lie still rankled him all these years later, knowing that he could never hear Jane call him father, as Sansa and Arya did, but of course Robert could not know that. So instead he merely replied, "She is beautiful still, yes. Any fool could see that. But no, I have not asked her to mine and Catelyn's bed. Nor will I. I love Catelyn, Robert. I love her with all my heart, and I will do nothing to make her uncomfortable." Robert merely grunted. "Very well then, I might just have to try for myself and see." His booming laughter ran throughout the crypts. Ned even smiled, though he knew if Robert tried anything with Ashara he was likely to lose a limb or two. Robert continued, "You must have wondered why I finally came north to Winterfell after so long." Ned had his suspicions, but he said nothing. Instead, he waited for Robert to continue speaking. "Lord Eddard Stark, I would name you the Hand of the King." Ned dropped to one knee. The offer did not surprise him. What other reason could Robert have had for coming so far? The Hand of the King was the second most powerful man in the Seven Kingdoms. He spoke with the king's voice, commanded the king's armies, and drafted the king's laws. At times he even sat upon the Iron Throne to dispense the king's justice, when the king was absent, sick, or otherwise indisposed. Robert was offering him a responsibility as large as the realm itself. It was the last thing in the world he wanted. "Your Grace, I am not worthy of the honor." Robert groaned with good-humored impatience. "If I wanted to honor you, I'd let you retire. I'm planning to make you run the kingdom and fight the wars while I eat and drink and wench myself into an early grave. He slapped his gut and grinned. Then his old friend sprung something that he truly had not been expecting. We were meant to rule together. If Lyanna had lived, we should have been brothers, bound by blood as well as affection. Well, it is not too late. I have a son. You have a daughter. My Joff and your Sansa shall join our houses as Lyanna and I might once have done. Sansa is only 11. Robert waved an impatient hand. Old enough for betrothal. The marriage can wait a few years. Now stand up and say yes, curse you. Nothing would give me greater pleasure, your grace. Ned answered. He hesitated. These honors are all so unexpected. May I have some time to consider? I need to tell my wife. Yes, of course, tell Catelyn. Sleep on it if you must. Just don't keep me waiting too long. I am not the most patient of men. They left the crypts then, Ned's head still reeling from all that had been said. He could not truly enjoy the feast that was held later that day as a result. His mind was still reeling from everything Robert had asked of him and told him. He needed time to think it all through. He needed time to tell Catelyn. He wanted to give Robert a good reason as to why he did not wish to go south. No Stark had ever gone south and lived to tell the tale. His father had gone south and died, so too had Brandon. Lyanna had died in Dorne. No, he did not wish to go south to the Viper's Nest they called a capital, especially not with his girls there. No. He had thought that Catelyn would agree with him, but she urged him to go, saying how it would ensure that their family remained safe and secure. She argued that Robert the King was not the same man as the Robert he had known as a boy, nor even the same man he had known during the rebellion. She argued that kingship would have changed Robert, and that it did no good to reject a king's demand. He knew deep down that she was right. She was always right. That did not make it any easier. He still wished to stay in the north where he belonged, where all Starks belonged, but then Sansa would marry Joffrey, and he had seen something dark in the boy that unnerved him, something he did not like the look of. He would need to be there to protect Sansa from those vipers in the court. Once Catelyn read the letter her sister Lisa had sent her, in which she blamed the Lannisters, most specifically the Queen, for the death of her lord husband. Catelyn insisted that he had to go south to bring Jon Arryn's killers to justice, something Maester Luwin also said would be wise to do. Catelyn argued that Robert would listen to him if he brought enough evidence to convict the king. She said she had friends in King's Landing who could help him in his inquiries. Reluctantly, he agreed with Catelyn, and the next day told Robert of his acceptance of the handship. In typical Robert fashion, they had to throw another grand feast to celebrate both his acceptance of the handship and Sansa and Joffrey's betrothal. The prince Ned noticed seemed to be on his best behavior during the feast. He was very charming towards Sansa and even Jane, though Ned saw the hateful looks he shot Robb and Jon, and he saw the way Jon's mouth tightened whenever he looked at Joffrey. Something bad was brewing between those two, and he would need to stop it before it could blow out of control. Later, as the feast began to unwind, the children were in bed. Catelyn had retired for the night. Robert was fiddling with some serving wench, and the Queen and her brother were nowhere to be seen. Ned found himself walking Ashara back to her room. He had not spent any time alone with Ashara since she had been in Winterfell, making perfectly sure that whenever he was forced to be in her company there were plenty of people in the room. He loved Catelyn with all his heart and being, but there was some sort of pull Ashara had over him that he feared. "So, your girl is to be wed to the crown prince," he heard Ashara say. "Yes, a good match. Perfect even. Sansa is delighted," Ned replied. He heard Ashara snort. "Yes, well, you might wish to caution her against expecting a fairy tale, especially from royalty." "Ashara," he began, but she interrupted him. "It is true, you know, Ned. When Elia found out she was to marry Rhaegar, she was giddy with delight. She was so happy not even her frailties could keep her bedridden for long. And then she learnt that life was not a fairy tale, and Rhaegar broke his vows." Ashara spoke coldly. Ned felt himself tense then. He said nothing, but as Ashara broke away from him and moved toward her room, she stopped and turned round, and said, "Just so you know, Jon does not like the prince, any more than Oberyn liked Rhaegar. Keep an eye on him, something will happen soon if you don't." With that, she walked inside and closer the door, leaving him feeling perplexed. "Jon," Jon watched Bran and Prince Tommen practice their sword fighting with wooden swords, and cheered with Robb and Theon as Bran managed to hit Prince Tommen again and again, until he eventually managed to knock him to the ground. Jon was not sure what to make of the royal family. King Robert had been a huge disappointment to him. He had grown up listening to his uncle's tales of a strong, brave man who had fought a war for his Aunt Lyanna. In his head he had always pictured Robert Baratheon as a tall man, who was strong and built like an aurochs. The man he had seen was a fat old man, who seemed more happy drinking and wenching than doing anything else. The queen was beautiful but cold. Not at all like Jon's own mother, who possessed warmth that the queen seemed to lack. Had even Aunt Catelyn agreed with that assessment when Jon had spoke with her and his mother the other day. Prince Joffrey was a prick. Robb, Theon, even Jane agreed. The Crown Prince thought himself above everything and everyone in Winterfell, and Jon did not like him one bit. Ever since his betrothal to Jon's cousin Sansa had been announced, the prince had only grown cockier, strutting around Winterfell like he owned the place, and he was arrogant. So very, very arrogant. Though of course whenever Sansa was present he never failed to act chivalrously and kindly. So of course Sansa thought herself in love with him. It was so infuriating. Though of course when he had brought this up with his mother and Jane they had both laughed and claimed that he was jealous. Which was ridiculous. Why would he be jealous of some spoiled 12-year-old when he was going to join the Watch? Jon listened as Robb and Theon and Alice and Jane cheered Bran on as he knocked Prince Tommen to the ground once more. Robb and Alice, Jon thought, made a very good couple. Alice was kind and smart, and she treated Jane like a proper person, not like some weakling, which of course made Jon like her that much more. There were many things he could take, like the fact that he was a bastard, but one thing he could not tolerate was people treating Jane differently or even making fun of her because of her health. In fact, he had gotten into trouble more than once because he had fought whoever had dared insult his sister. Jon felt something was about to go horribly wrong. When Prince Joffrey moved himself into the sunlight, he sounded bored. "This is a game for children, Ser Roderick." Theon gave a bark of laughter. "You are children." "Robb may be a child," Joffrey said. "I am a prince, and I grow tired of swatting at Starks with a play sword." "You got more swats than you gave, Joff," Robb said. "Are you afraid?" Prince Joffrey looked at him. "Oh, terrified," he said. "You're so much older." Some of the Lannister men laughed. Jon groaned inwardly. Robb was being baited. Ser Roderick tugged thoughtfully at his white whiskers. "What are you suggesting?" he asked the prince. "Live steel." "Done," said Robb. "You'll be sorry." The master-at-arms put a hand on Robb's shoulder to quiet him. "Live steel is too dangerous. I will permit you tourney swords with blunted edges." Joffrey sneered at that and said, "Does Winterfell breed cowards, or is it just you, Robb? Why hide behind tourney swords if not because you are a coward?" Jon saw Robb bristle and was thankful that Alice laid a hand on his arm to keep him still. Otherwise he knew not what Robb would do. He did not expect Jane to speak then. "That is not very gallant of you, Your Grace. Mocking a man who will soon be your ally, that is not smart at all, especially when you are a guest here." Joffrey turned his attention to Jane and sneered at her. His voice was laced with venom when he spoke next. "Do you threaten me, Sand? A bastard girl, who is so frail it would be better if she was to fall asleep and never wake again. You would seek to give advice to me?" Jon tensed. Jane meanwhile merely said, "I did not mean to cause offense, Your Grace. Forgive me if I did. I merely thought it would be wise to ask you not to offend Winterfell and the Starks when you are a guest here." Joffrey spat venom then. "Oh, so you thought to counsel me, did you? Well, let me counsel you. Next time I want your advice, which will be never, I will ask it of you. In fact, come to think of it, you could help me with something now." Jane looked at Joffrey inquisitively. "Oh, and what might that be, Your Grace?" Jon saw Joffrey turn his head for a moment, looking at the assortment of men and squires gathered around him, before he turned back to face Jane, a smirk upon his face. "I hear your mother was a slut when she was younger. Perhaps you have inherited some of her promiscuity. I want you to come to my chambers tonight and suck my cock. That is, if your frail health does not kill you." Some of the men next to Joffrey laughed nervously. Joffrey smirked then. Jane remained silent, as did Robb, Theon, Alice, and Ser Roderick. Jon, though, felt himself go black with rage. How dare this insolent little shit insult his mother and his sister? Before he knew what he was doing, he had moved from where he had been standing and was striding toward Joffrey. He vaguely heard someone shouting his name. It could have been Jane or Robb, it made no difference. He advanced upon Joffrey, raised his right hand, curled it into a fist, and punched Joffrey in the face once, twice, thrice, 4 times. He punched him a total of 10 times before he was eventually hauled off of the Crown Prince. By the time he was done, Joffrey had a bloody lip and a swollen eye. Jon was fuming. He was straining against Theon and Ser Roderick, wanting to cause Joffrey more harm. Then he felt Jane's hand on his cheek. And then she was in front of him, her violet eyes filled with concern. She leaned forward and whispered in his ear, Jon, sweetling, it's okay. Everything's fine, Jon. It's okay, come back to me, Jon. Come back to me. And slowly Jon felt his breathing return to normal, and then he felt Theon and Ser Roderick release him, and he fell into Jane's arms, holding her tightly and sobbing. Later, once he had calmed down, he was brought before his uncle, his aunt, and his mother and the king. Lord Eddard looked solemn. In fact, they all looked solemn and grim, and for a moment Jon feared that he would have to be executed. His uncle spoke first, with his lord's voice. Jon, do you know why you have been brought here? Jon nodded. Yes, uncle. King Robert sighed then, and Jon turned to look at the king. Robert had a sad look in his eyes when he spoke. Very well then. Joffrey says that you attacked him unprovoked. Is that true? Jon bristled with anger. No, your grace, it is not. Prince Joffrey insulted my sister and my lady mother. He said that my lady mother was a whore, and he insulted Jane's health. I admit that perhaps I went too far, but something had to be done. I won't let anyone insult my mother or my sister, not for as long as I live. He heard his mother and Aunt Catelyn sob. His uncle Ned and the king both sighed. Very well then, Ned. He saw his uncle step forward then and look at the king. See that your nephew is kept indoors for the rest of our stay here. I don't want Joff or Cersei kicking up a fuss. Yes, your grace. And so it was that Jon was kept to his room, unable to leave unless it was for dinner or to use the toilet. Ghost was his companion, and occasionally his mother or Jane would come and visit him, but the rest of the family did not, or could not, from what Jane told him, because they had to pretend to be making amends with the Baratheons. Jon did not regret what he had done. He was sorry, though, that his uncle had to pay because Joffrey was a little crybaby. He was in his room when Bran fell, and then the castle went into mourning. Catelyn. Ned and the girls and the royal party and Lady Ashara and Jane and Jon had been gone for 8 days now. Ned and the girls for King's Landing, Ashara and Jane for Starfall, and Jon, her nephew, her strong nephew who had beaten the prince when he had dared insult Jane, had gone north to the Wall. Cersei had been furious when she had found out what had happened to her son, and had demanded that Jon be severely punished, and so it had been agreed with Jon's consent that he be sent to the Wall with Benjen. That Jon had wanted to go to the Wall in the first place was not mentioned to the royals. Catelyn was only glad that the royals had left. She did not like them any more than Ned did, and yet he rode south with them even though Bran lay in his bed, dead to the world. Asleep for all 8 days, Jon had alerted them to his fall from the broken tower, and they had all deliberated how he could have fallen. Her little boy never fell. Everyone in Winterfell knew that. She thought back to Lysa's letter and wondered if perhaps Bran had seen something he was not supposed to see. Robb had come to her and begged her to eat, to move from her vigil beside Bran's bedside. But she could not do it, not now. No, she couldn't leave him here alone. Not when he could need her at any moment. She knew she was being unfair to Robb. She knew that some must think her mad. But she could not help it. Her baby Bran was hurt and might die, and she could not leave his side. Not even for a moment. Robb had been about to speak with her again to try and coerce her into moving when he had seen the library tower on fire and had rushed to put the fire out. She said a silent prayer to the 7 faces of God as she went to the window. Across the bailey, long tongues of flame shot from the windows of the library. She watched the smoke rise into the sky and thought sadly of all the books the Starks had gathered over the centuries. Then she closed the shutters. When she turned away from the window, the man was in the room with her. You weren't supposed to be here, he muttered sourly. No one was supposed to be here. He was a small dirty man in filthy brown clothing, and he stank of horses. Catelyn knew all the men who worked in their stables, and he was none of them. He was gaunt, with limp blonde hair and pale eyes deep sunk in a bony face, and there was a dagger in his hand. Catelyn looked at the knife, then at Bran. "No," she said. The word stuck in her throat, the merest whisper. He must have heard her. "It's a mercy," he said. "He's dead already." "No," Catelyn said louder now as she found her voice again. She spun back toward the window to scream for help, but the man moved faster than she would have believed. One hand clamped down over her mouth and yanked her head. The other brought the dagger up to her windpipe. The stench of him was overwhelming. She reached up with both hands and grabbed the blade with all her strength, pulling it away from her throat. She heard him cursing into her ear. Her fingers were slippery with blood, but she would not let go of the dagger. The hand over her mouth clenched more tightly, shutting off her air. Catelyn twisted her head to the side and managed to get a piece of his flesh between her teeth. She bit down hard into his palm. The man grunted in pain. She ground her teeth together and tore at him, and all of a sudden he let go. The taste of his blood filled her mouth. She sucked in air and screamed, and he grabbed her hair and pulled her away from him, and she stumbled and went down, and then he was standing over her, breathing hard, shaking. Catelyn saw the shadow slip through the open door behind him. There was a low rumble, less than a snarl, the merest whisper of a threat, but he must have heard something because he started to turn just as the wolf Bran's wolf made its leap. They went down together, half sprawled over Catelyn where she'd fallen. The wolf ripped the man's jaw open and then tore into his throat, leaving him no time to scream. The blood splattered all over the floor, and some of it covered Catelyn. That was how they found her. Sat against Bran's bed, with his dire wolf standing over the assassin's body, his muzzle bloody. Later, once Maester Luwin had seen to her wounds, she spoke with Robb, and they discussed the fire and the attacker. It seemed that the assassin had been a part of King Robert's entourage that had ridden to Winterfell and had likely been sleeping in the stables waiting for the right moment to strike. He had set the fire as a diversion, hoping that all of the men and even Catelyn would be too busy trying to put the fire out, that they would leave Bran unguarded. Had it not been for his direwolf, she and her son would have been dead now. Once more guards had been posted in front of Bran and her room, as well as Rickon's and Robb and Alice's. She called for a meeting in the Gods' Wood in front of the Heart Tree. And it was there that she told her son, his wife, and Ser Roderick and Maester Luwin, as well as Theon Greyjoy, about her suspicions about who had pushed Bran and why, as well as about her sister's letter accusing the Lannisters for Jon Arryn's death. After much discussion, it was decided that she would travel to King's Landing. She and Ser Roderick would take a ship from White Harbor and get to King's Landing before Ned and the Lannisters, and she would present her findings to Ned. Unbeknownst to the party, hidden behind one of the trees in the Godswood was a auburn-haired wench who had been sent north from King's Landing. She quickly made her way back to her lodgings to let her master know the news of an imminent arrival. Robb. Winterfell had become much quieter since Father, the girls, and Jon and Jane had left. There was less hustle and bustle about his home. It was almost eerily quiet, and then someone had sent an assassin to try and kill Bran, and Mother had gone to King's Landing to tell Father about the attack and bring the people behind the attack to justice. Despite this, there was much work that still needed to be done around Winterfell, and as such Robb found that he spent most of his waking hours talking with the men of the castle, seeing to restoration work of the library tower, and taking daily reports from the guards and Theon about the security in the castle. He did not wish for there to be any more unsuspecting attacks on himself or his family. All of this work often meant that he had very little time to actually spend with either his wife or his baby brother Rickon. As such, though he was very grateful for Alice and her understanding, she spent most of her day with Rickon, making sure that he went to his lessons and generally stayed out of trouble. Of course, when they both had some spare time in the evenings, once dinner had been had and Rickon had been put to bed, they spent time with each other and coupled. It was quite a nice experience, and Robb could now fully understand why Theon would often speak about it so often. As of yet, though, their coupling had yet to produce a child, but Robb was not too concerned about that, for they had plenty of time, and with Father still alive, they would not need to have children for some time. No, Robb liked to spend the time he had with his wife, merely enjoying her body simply because he could and because he liked her a lot. He had known Alice since they were 6 when she had come with her father when Lord Karstark had come visiting for official business. She had since told him that he had come there hoping to get a betrothal between her and him. Of course that had finally happened some years later when he had turned 10 and 3. Since then she had spent more time visiting Winterfell and he had gotten to know her. His wife was a very good-looking and very energetic. She reminded him of a slightly older version of Arya, albeit a much more prettier and of course nicer version of Arya, and she was of course not his sister. "What are you dreaming about, husband?" he heard his wife ask, amusement evident in her tone. Robb grinned wolfishly and said, "Why you of course wife, come here." And with that he pulled her flush against him, and titled her head up and kissed her full on the mouth. He did not care that they were standing in the middle of the hall and that someone could see them. It seemed neither did his wife, for she responded eagerly to his kiss, and when he put his tongue into her mouth she groaned appreciatively. And then their tongues were locked together and he groaned into her mouth. Alice was the one to break the kiss, pulling away and grinning slyly when he groaned in protest. Now, Robb, we can't have your reputation sullied now, can we? Lords of Winterfell are meant to be grim and solemn. It would be bad for your image if people knew that Lords of Winterfell actually had some feelings." She laughed. Robb grinned again, but also blushed and was about to respond when Maester Luwin came approaching from Bran's room. The Maester was breathing heavily, and he took a moment to stop and collect his breath. Then he spoke. "My lord, I came as soon as I could. I think you might want to come to Lord Brandon's room." He felt his chest tighten then. Alice came and squeezed his hand reassuringly and asked, "What's happened? Is Bran okay?" Maester Luwin nodded and said, "He has woken, my lord, my lady." Robb looked at Alice and smiled at her. Then he looked at Maester Luwin and told him to lead the way. He and Alice followed Luwin to Bran's room, where old Nan was sitting fast asleep in a rocking chair beside the bed. Bran was lying propped up with his head against a pillow, his dire wolf lying stretched out across the foot of his bed. Robb looked at Bran and smiled. "Bran, how are you feeling?" Bran looked like he wanted to cry. "I can't feel my legs, Robb. Why can't I feel my legs?" Robb sighed. Alice squeezed his hand reassuringly and he spoke. "You fell, Bran. You fell from the broken tower." Bran looked indignant as Robb suspected he might. "I didn't fall. I never fall." Robb sighed again and this time said in a more comforting tone, "You did, Bran, but it's not your fault." Then Bran looked up from where he was on the bed. Robb turned to see Maester Luwin walking into the room with Rickon, who immediately bounded up and hugged Bran. Shaggy Dog nipped playfully and Bran's as yet unnamed direwolf. Bran looked at Robb again and asked in a small voice, "Where's Mother, Robb? I remember her being here. I heard her speak to me. I thought she would be here." Robb felt his heart tighten. Bran sounded so scared and frightened. "Mother was here, Bran. She stayed beside your bed for as long as she could. But she had to go and see Father about something. She'll be home soon." He couldn't tell his brother the truth as to why Mother had gone south. Not yet, at least, not until Bran was better, not until he felt better, of that much he was certain of. "Oh," Bran said, and he sounded so small and tired. "We'll be back later. Shall I leave you here with Nan and Rickon?" Robb asked. Bran nodded and then said something in such a quiet voice that Robb wasn't sure what he had said, and so he asked his little brother, and Bran responded, "Summer. My dire wolf is called Summer." Robb nodded, then walked out of the room with Alice to go and think about other things. As the days passed and turned into weeks, and still Mother did not come back to Winterfell, Robb began to worry, but Alice said that perhaps she was simply spending time with Sansa and Arya as well, and so Robb did not think too long and what her continued absence might mean. Bran continued to improve. He was no longer so frail as he had been when he first woke up. He no longer slept for most of the day, and was able to travel about the castle on Hotter's back. He seemed to be in a better mood because of it, though Robb knew that Bran still felt sad that he could no longer walk nor climb. Bran could not remember much of what had happened before he had fallen. He remembered climbing the broken tower, but he had no memory after that, not until he had woken up in his bed. Robb had asked him twice, and then after the second time had gone to Maester Lewin and asked him his thoughts on the matter. The Maester said that it was not unusual for a person who had experienced a shock or a traumatic even to have memory lapses, and Bran's fall certainly classed as a traumatic experience, and so Robb let it slide, determined to wait for Mother to come back from King's Landing until he asked any more questions. If all went according to plan, Mother would come back with the answers and they would not have to worry about it anymore. Just to make absolutely sure though, Robb often went to the broken tower with Alice and Theon to see if there could be any clues as to whom or what might have caused Bran's fall. Robb had spent many a time during his own childhood hiding and playing in the broken tower with Jon and Theon, and occasionally Jane when her health permitted it. It was a good place to hide, for no one really ever came there. As they looked around the edges of the tower where Jon had found Bran, they saw nothing of note, though grey wind did begin to whine softly the further up the tower they got, until they were at the top of the tower, in a place that Robb knew had once been a solar, and there hidden amongst the rubble of the tower they found a single golden curl. A few days after they had found the golden curl, Bran told him that Sansa's direwolf lady had been killed. When asked how he knew this, Bran simply said that Summer knew that his sister was no longer there, and it seemed Grey Wind and Shaggy Dog knew this as well, for they howled for hours. And then later that night a raven came from their father on the King's Road to tell them that there had been an incident on the King's Road involving Sansa, Arya, a butcher's boy, and Prince Joffrey, and that lady, Sansa's direwolf, had been executed. Robb had the suspicion that there was something more to this story, and he had a sneaking feeling that it had more to do with Joffrey being a prick than his father let on. He still remembered how Joffrey had looked down upon Winterfell and the North the whole time he had been here, and he also remembered how the prince had insulted Jon and Jane's mother as well as Jane, and he remembered how Jon had beaten the prince bloody, and then because the prince had run sobbing to his mother, Jon had been forced to go to the wall with Uncle Benjen. When Robb had been convinced Jon would either stay in Winterfell or go back south with Aunt Ashara and Jane. Then Tyrion Lannister came to Winterfell. Given what his mother had said, and the golden curl they had found in Winterfell, Robb thought that he could be excused for being suspicious of why the imp was in Winterfell, especially when he began asking Bran all sorts of questions. "My brother is not here for your questioning, Lannister," Robb said in his lord's voice. The imp's eyes had quirked with amusement, and he had then continued questioning Bran about his fall and what he remembered about it. From the way he was asking his questions, Robb got the feeling that perhaps the imp was blameless in the attack on Bran, and that perhaps he should bring his suspicions to him. A feeling that was further enforced when the imp presented a design for a saddle that would allow Bran to ride a horse comfortably once more. Robb tried to apologize for his earlier briskness by offering the imp a room in Winterfell, but the man declined and instead said that he would be spending the night in a brothel. Once Lord Tyrion had left the Great Hall, Robb began speaking with Yoren, the man who had come the wall. He asked him about how Jon was getting on and how Uncle Benjen was doing. Yoren's eyes quirked with amusement and something that might have been pride when he spoke of Jon. Lord Sand is getting on just fine. He's made a few friends, I believe, an aurochs, a pig, and a bunch of half-wits. But he's a good lad, stubborn too and proud, but quiet as well. He's getting on fine. Your Uncle Benjen, I could not say. He went out on a ranging before I left. Last I heard he hadn't returned." Robb thanked Yoren, and then once dinner was done for the night, helped escort Bran and Rickon to bed, and listened as Alice told them both a story to help them sleep, and then as they entered their rooms Robb voiced his thoughts from earlier in the day. "I think I might tell Lord Tyrion about our suspicions. What do you think, my lady?" Alice looked up from the mirror where she was brushing her hair for bed and said, "I believe you should mention the golden curl, but nothing more. Let Lord Tyrion figure it out for himself. But it is up to you, Robb." Robb smiled at her then and walked over to her and pulled the brush from her and began brushing her hair himself. As he brushed, he heard his wife hum, and then she said, "Robb, I have something that I want to tell you." Robb ceased brushing his wife's hair and put the brush on the table, and then looked at her. "Go on, Alice." Alice gave him a nervous smile then and said, "I think I might be pregnant, Jon." The wall was not like anything he had expected. He had thought that the wall would be just like it had seemed in the stories old Nan had told him and his sister and cousins when they were children. He realized now that he had wanted it to be like that so that he could justify why he had left his sister and his mother behind. After he had punched Joffrey and been brought before the king, he had been confined to his room, but then he had been called before the king once more, except this time the queen was there as was Joffrey, and the little blonde-haired shit had lied to his father and mother and told them how Jon had attacked him like a savage and that he had merely been having a polite conversation with Jane. Jon knew that neither his uncle nor the king believed what the prince was saying, and yet, because Queen Cersei was there, the king had to believe what Joffrey had said, and had told Jon that it was a grievous thing to assault the heir to the Iron Throne, and that in the days of the Targaryens one who struck a royal would lose the offending limb. But the king's mouth had quirked with anger as he said the name Targaryen, and Jon had hoped briefly that he would get free. But then the king had said that whilst he was no barbarian, Jon would have to suffer the consequences of his actions and would have to take the black. Jon agreed to take the black, though that was no longer what he had wanted to do. He knew how ill Jane was. He knew that he was needed in Starfall if not Winterfell. His mother needed him there, to help her look after Edric, Illyria and Jane. His family needed him, and yet here he was stuck in the far north, stuck with thieves and rapists and men without honor and cravens. Here he was at the place where he had thought he could make a name for himself, and here he was stuck until the end of his days, for though he had not yet taken his vows he knew that he could not flee from the Watch, not now that he was here. He had learnt many things from his time in Winterfell, and he knew that he could not shame his uncle. He would not do that. His name might be sand, but the blood of the Starks ran through his veins, and if this was to be his fate, so be it. He would accept it, and he would do what he could to make the best of it. He only hoped that he could have time to visit his mother and Jane and perhaps attend Illyria's wedding. He had gotten along well with Lord Tyrion. A bastard and an imp, what a company they made. Jon had found that he liked the imp best of the Lannister siblings, whereas the Queen and the Kingslayer seemed to be full of them and considered anyone else not of their family to be beneath them. Tyrion was a laugh. He traded japes easily and gave as good as he got. And he was one of the few people who had not seemed to find Jane a pitiful girl in the king's party, something that had greatly endeared him to Jon. For Jon had even heard the king say something about Jane's ill health, and he had been so tempted to skewer the king for saying that. How dare the man, the fat oaf, the child killer question the worth of his sister? It had been Tyrion who had turned the boys, the new recruits from trying to kill Jon, into some of his best friends. Tyrion had opened Jon's eyes to the reality of their situation. Whilst he may have been a bastard, he had been fortunate to grow up in Starfall and Winterfell, where he had received some very good tuition in swordsmanship and weaponry, whereas these boys had had little to none, and had no one to teach them. And Tyrion had told him, his mismatched eyes serious for once. Let us be honest here, Jon. Alliser Thorne is not the best of teachers. Should the wildlings ever strike south in great force, these boys will be the first ones to die. It would do them some good to have a teacher who did not hate them as such. He had looked at Jon then, and it had seemed like his eyes were looking into the depths of Jon's soul. Jon had agreed to change his approach to and had soon taken to showing his fellow recruits, Pyp, Gren, Darion, Halder and the rest, the lessons he had been taught by Ser Roderick and his sister's sworn sword Ser Arthur. That earned him the scorn of Ser Thorne, but it had also earned him the respect and friendship of those who had formerly been his enemies and foes. The Sam had arrived. Big, fat, and with so many chins he could have beaten King Robert with them. Samwell Tarly came from the Reach, the eldest son of Randall Tarly, Lord of Horn Hill. He had taken the black to spare his father the embarrassment of having a craven for an heir. Try as he might, Jon just could not seem to get Sam to fight properly without blubbering like a baby. Initially his friends had wanted to have some fun with Sam, but one quick word from him and they had all taken to Sam and were now protecting him from Thorne's brutality. He dearly hoped that Sam would learn quick enough, that in this place filled with rapers and thieves and men with no honor, it would do no good to be a craven. That was a lesson Jon had learnt the hard way and something he intended to make sure that Sam never had to suffer. Before Tyrion had left the wall for his journey back south, Jon had received a raven from Winterfell writ in Robb's hand that told of how Bran was awake. It also mentioned of how an assassin had tried to kill Bran whilst he was still unconscious, and how Bran's direwolf, which he was calling Summer, had saved him and Aunt Catelyn. Jon had been deeply concerned by that, and his concerns were heightened even more when he saw that Robb wrote that they suspected that the Lannisters had had a part to play in Bran's fall, and mayhaps even the attempt on his life. Jon had spoken with Tyrion the night before the man was due to leave for the south, He had not mentioned Rob's suspicions, only that he hoped that Tyrion could do what he could to make Bran's life easier, now that he was awake. He also asked him to make some of his own inquiries as to why Bran fell. Tyrion promised him that he would do just that and would find a way to tell Jon what he had found. When he watched Tyrion leave the next day, Jon had felt slightly more comfortable with himself. He knew Tyrion would stay true to his word. He could only hope nothing ill befell him. That had left Jon on his lonesome with his new friends. For his uncle Benjen had left the day before Tyrion had, to go on a ranging north of the wall to discover what had become of Weimar Royce and the ranging party he had led north of the wall some months ago. His uncle had left some 2 weeks ago, and had yet to return. Jon was not too worried though, for he had spoken to old Maester Aemon about some of the rangings that had happened in the past, and the old Maester had told him that it often took many moons for a ranging party to return from the north, for they had to make especially certain that nothing followed them when they returned. A system that had been started by the first Lord Commander that old Aemon had served under one Lord Commander Dayne. It was getting closer to the time when the new recruits, including Jon, would have to swear their vows, and Jon was determined to do it in front of the heart tree in the God's Wood north of the wall. He might have been born in Dorne, but he felt more of a connection with the old gods, the ones he felt had true power, at least in the north. The old bear had read out where the recruits would be going, and Jon had been desperately hoping that he would become a ranger like his uncle Benjen, and so had been deeply disappointed when the old bear read out his name for the stewards. And then when he was told by old Maester Aemon that he would be the old bear's steward, he had been even more disappointed. And then Sam had told him that meant that the old bear was grooming him for leadership, perhaps to be a future Lord Commander. Jon had looked at Sam then, at his friend's big smiling face, and had felt like punching it, and punching it hard. He did not wish to be Lord Commander in the future. Hell, he didn't even want to be a man of the Night's Watch. The more he thought about it, the more he was certain he wanted to be in Starfall with his mother and Jane. He missed them terribly, even more than he missed his cousins, though he did briefly wonder how Sansa and Arya were getting on in King's Landing, and whether or not Arya still had that little Bravos blade he had give her. Then the day came for him to swear his vows. He rode out with Sam, Gren, PYP and Halder and several of the senior men of the Night's Watch past the wall and to the nearby Godswood. He knelt before the heart tree and before instructed to say the vows, said a quick prayer to the old gods, to his father's gods, to his uncle's gods. Please make me strong enough to accept this hand I have been given. Please give me the strength to do what is right. The old Bowen Marsh told them to say their vows, and as the wind blew in something fierce and caused the branches of the heart tree to sway, their voices rang out as unison. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. It shall not end until my death. I shall take no wife, hold no lands, and father no children. I shall wear no crowns and win no glory. I shall live and die at my post. I am the sword in the darkness. I am the watcher on the walls. I am the fire that burns against the cold, the light that brings the dawn, the horn that wakes the sleepers, the shield that guards the realms of men. I pledge my life and honor to the Night's Watch, for this night and all nights to come. Then when they had all said their words, Bowen Marsh spoke. You came here boys, rapers, thieves, and bastards. Rise now as men and brothers of the Night's Watch. And so they did. They rose from their position next to the heart tree. Jon said a quick prayer, and then their fellow brothers were there to congratulate them and welcome them officially to the Brotherhood. As Jon shook hands and accepted congratulations, and even as he rode back to Castle Black, he could not help the strange sense of foreboding that seemed to have recently formed in his mind, as he had said his vows. He could have sworn he felt a chill creep up on him, and he could have sworn he heard the wind whisper his name. He dismissed the thoughts from his mind the minute he was back in Castle Black, and made his way to the Lord Commander's tower and his own room. The old bear would likely have no need for him tonight. He fell asleep with the fire roaring in the hearth, and Ghost curled up next to him on the bed. When he awoke, the fire had died out and Ghost was at the door, his teeth bared. "What's wrong, Ghost?" Jon asked, his eyes still groggy from sleep. Ghost just kept his teeth bared, and began pawing at the door. "What's wrong, Ghost?" Jon asked again. Ghost kept pawing at the door, then turned to look at him and began whining. "Is there something outside, boy?" Ghost turned back to the door and began nudging it with his head. Jon relented and opened the door. Ghost sped off down the hall. Jon called after him and raced after him, and found Ghost pawing at the Lord Commander's door. He heard footsteps from the other side of the door. "Lord Commander?" Jon asked. There was no response. The footsteps seemed to be getting heavier. Jon called out once more. Still no response. Next to him, Ghost whined louder and louder. Jon called out once more, and when he got no response, he put his whole body behind him as he shoved down the door. And what he saw scared him senseless. The dead Black Brother, who had turned up outside the castle gates that morning, was walking around looking for the Lord Commander's room, no doubt. Jon was so shocked he knew not what to do. Ghost, however, it seemed did, for he leapt into the air, and Jon watched stunned as man and wolf went falling to the ground. Ghost ripped the thing's throat open, but all that did was annoy the thing more. It shoved Ghost off and staggered drunkenly toward Jon. Jon stood there frozen, watching the dead Black Brother advance toward him. Just as it was about to reach him, Ghost pounced on it from behind and brought it down. Then Jon felt a cold hand grip him and turned to see the other dead Black Brother staring at him with ice-blue eyes. Jon unfroze and shook the brother off and quickly drew his long sword, and began hacking and slashing at the creature, but to no avail. Whenever he cut it, the creature simply kept moving toward him until it knocked the sword from his hand, and they fell to the floor wrestling each other. Jon feared he would be crushed under the sheer weight of the dead Black Brother. He had been a big man in life. Close to him, he heard Jon tearing into the other Black Brother, and out the corner of his eye he saw a lamp nearby that looked close to falling. It took all his strength, but he managed to flip the dead Black Brother over his head, and so that when he fell, the lamp fell onto him, burning him instantly, and Jon watched as he staggered to his feet, as the dead Black Brother burnt and was reduced to ash. Ghost was still tearing into the other dead Black Brother nearby, but Jon saw the old bear standing in the doorway to his room, still in a dressing gown, a lamp in his hand, his eyes groggy. "What in the seven hells is going on?" the old bear asked, his voice laced with tired anger. Before Jon could answer, the dead Black Brother pushed Ghost off of him and staggered drunkenly upward and toward the old bear. Jon tried to shout a warning, but to no avail. It seemed his tongue had disappeared. Instead, he lunged forward and took the lamp from the old bear's hand and threw it at the advancing Black Brother. The dead brother caught fire, and Jon watched him burn and prayed that that would be enough. He looked down to see Ghost panting heavily beside him, and then the fire began to spread. The next day, the Lord Commander's tower was a shadow of what it had been before. Parts of it had been burnt by the fire that had killed the two whites. Jon's hand had been burnt during the final fire, as he had tried to help the old bear out of the room and out of the tower. They had succeeded, but Jon's hand had been as black as Shaggy Dog by the end of it. Thankfully, it was his left hand, so it was nothing too serious. And Maester Aemon had treated it and bandaged it, and had said that with some luck and some time it would be fit to use once more. The Lord Commander was housing himself in another part of Castle Black for the time being, and so Jon was also housed there. He had been called before the old bear this morning, and as such had been attending to him for most of the day, and yet Jon could not help but think that there was something more the old bear wanted to say to him. What it was, though, he was not sure. He was surprised when he opened the Lord Commander's door and found Maester Aemon standing in the doorway being helped by Sam. "Jon Sand?" Maester Aemon asked. "Yes, Maester, I'm here," Jon replied. The Maester smiled. "Good. Help me into the room. The Lord Commander wished for me to come here." Jon nodded and moved to grab Aemon's other hand and helped him walk and sit down in a chair by the fire. The Lord Commander entered the room at that moment. "Ah, Aemon, you're here, good. Sit, Jon." So Jon sat in a chair next to Maester Aemon. Sam went to leave, but Mormont bade him stay. Mormont coughed and then spoke. "You did well yesterday, Jon. Quick thinking and reactions. Good work." Jon blushed. "It was Ghost, my lord, not me." Mormont laughed. Where is your dire wolf?" "Gone hunting," Jon replied. "More's the shame. I had something I meant to give him. Anyway, that can wait. I have something to give you." Jon watched as Mormont brought forth a sword in a sheath, and then passed it to Jon. "Unsheath it, Jon," Mormont said. And so he did. He gasped when he looked at it. It was a long sword that much was clear, but it was not as big as ice was, but it was bigger than Mormont's own sword Longclaw. It was colored pure silver steel, with ripples of flame across it, and on its pommel was the head of a dire wolf, a white one. "It's beautiful," Jon said in an awed tone. "Good. I'm glad you like it, Jon. It's yours," Mormont said. Jon looked at the old bear confused. "But my lord," he began. "But nothing," Mormont interrupted him. "You did the Night's Watch a great service last night, and this is your reward. Take it." Eamon tell Jon the story of the sword. Jon turned to Maester Eamon, as the maester took a deep breath and began to speak. "The sword you hold in your hand, Jon, is called Winter's Fury. It once belonged to a former Lord Commander called Brynden. He gave the sword to your great-grandfather's brother, one Brandon Stark, before he left for arranging. The Lord Commander told him that he no longer had need of the sword and that it was for Brandon to do with as he pleased. Brandon Stark was honored by the gift and so wielded the sword for many a year, until he died during arranging some 20 years ago. The sword has been kept in Castle Black ever since." "And you wish for me to have it?" Jon asked, confused. "Yes, it was once a Stark sword, and it is only right that a Stark should wield it once more." Jon wanted to point out that he was not a Stark, that he was not even a Snow, he was a Sand. But looking at the expectant expression in Mormont's eyes and the hopeful one in Sam's, he could do nothing more than simply nod and say, "Very well then. I'm honored." And that was how he came to have his own Valyrian steel sword. Eddard. The journey to King's Landing had been long and tiring and not without incident. When Bran had fallen, he had begged Robert to delay his departure for a few days, but his friend, the king, would not hear of it. And so Ned had had to leave Winterfell, and his wife and his sons, without ever getting to say a proper goodbye to them. Catelyn had wept and wept when it had come time for him to go. She had begged him not to leave to stay here in Winterfell with her and their sons, to tell Robert to go to the Seven Hells, and he had had to gently tell her he could not do that. He had to find whoever had killed Jon Arryn and bring them to justice. He had to help Robert run the realm and lessen Lannister influence. She had sniffed then and bade him a cold farewell. It still hurt to think about it. Then there had been the incident in the Riverlands on the King's Road with Arya, Joffrey, Sansa, and the butcher's boy. Joffrey accused Arya and her direwolf of attacking him, and Arya said that Nymeria was simply defending her. They both gave counter-stories, and Ned knew that Robert would be able to act against his heir in public, at least not with the Lannister woman present, and so he had asked Sansa to tell her side of the story. Ned had hoped that she might put her loyalty to her family before her feelings for Joffrey, but alas, she was only a 11-year-old girl, and she was scared too, and so she had spoken up for Joffrey much to Arya's discontent. The Queen had ordered Lady executed. Ned had pleaded with Robert. Such a measure was not necessary. Arya had already lost her direwolf. There was no need for Sansa to suffer, but Robert, the king, was so much different than Robert, his friend. The boy he had grown up with would have never listened to Cersei Lannister. He would have been outraged at the injustice being heaped on Sansa. He would have refused to have Lady executed. But that Robert was not the same Robert that Robert had perhaps died when Lyanna had died. Robert allowed the execution to take place. Ned decided to do it himself, and Sansa, he thought, had not forgiven him for it, and that hurt too. Throughout the rest of the journey to King's Landing, his girls were not speaking to each other. Joffrey walked around with an arrogant swagger, and the Queen seemed smug and happy with herself. The words Ashara had said to him before they had left Winterfell kept playing in his head. "There is something wrong with that boy, Ned. I know not what it is, but the fact that he would lie about something that we both know and that your child-killing friend know happened, that is something not even Rhaegar or Aerys would do. Even though it chilled him to think of it, he admitted that her words did make sense. Joffrey had been beaten to an inch of unconsciousness by Jon when he had insulted Jane and Ashara, and Jon had had to take the black. Joffrey had done something wrong in the Riverlands, and the butcher's boy and Nymeria and Lady had paid for it. Ned saw the way Joffrey's eyes seemed to glow with menace whenever he spoke to Arya or Tommen or Myrcella. But when he was in front of Sansa and his lady mother, he was the perfect gentleman. Ned knew there was something wrong with the boy, but what it was he knew not. They had arrived in King's Landing at roughly the same time that Jane and Ashara had arrived in Starfall. They had ridden with the royal party as far as Seaguard, before boarding a ship and heading off to Starfall due to Jane's ill health. Upon arriving in King's Landing, Ned had found that he had his work cut out for him. He quickly discovered that Robert did not bother to attend small council meetings and instead preferred to spend his time drinking and whoring. It fell to Ned to deal with the huge debt that the throne had. It fell to him to settle disputes between this lord and that lord, and it fell to him to organize the foolish tourney that Robert had decreed be held in his honor as hand. All the while he was trying to find out more about who killed Jon Arryn. Some of his investigations led him to speak with Pycelle about how Jon Arryn had suddenly fallen ill and whether or not poison may have been used. Varys told him to speak with Jon's former squire, but that did not work out, for the man was killed during the tourney. Lord Baelish, a man Ned knew not to trust, led him down the path of looking at Robert's bastards and pointed him toward a book he had been reading before he had died. A book about the heritages of the great houses and their lineages. At first it had seemed like nothing more than a dull read, and he could not truly understand why Jon had been reading this book. Then Catelyn had come to King's Landing. She came with a Valyrian steel dagger that she said had been used in an attempt to end Bran's life, and hers the fact that she was still alive, she said, was mainly because of Bran's direwolf. She said that the man who had wielded the dagger had been hiding out in the stables of Winterfell for some time, and had likely come with Robert's party to Winterfell. Catelyn also told him that she believed that the Lannisters were behind Bran's fall, and perhaps the attempt on Bran's life. Something that she became even more convinced of when Lord Baelish told them that the dagger in question had once belonged to him, but had since switched hands to belong to one Tyrion Lannister just before Robert had ridden for Winterfell. That had convinced Catelyn, but Ned still had his doubts. Why would Tyrion wish to kill Bran if he had visited him in Winterfell and given him a gift? It made no sense. There had to be another reason for it. But Catelyn had been convinced that it was the imp who had done it, and so he had relented, but he had begged her before she had ridden off to be safe and to be careful. Then Varys had brought news from across the narrow sea that Daenerys Targaryen was pregnant, and Robert had wanted her killed. Ned had argued fiercely against it. They were not child killers. Daenerys Targaryen was an innocent girl who had done no wrong against Robert or Ned. She had not been the one to steal Lyanna away in the dead of the night. She had not whispered sweet words filled with love his sister. She had not been the one whose actions had caused the realm to bleed 15 years ago. Why should she pay the price then for her brother's folly? Robert would hear none of it. Ever since they had heard that Rhaegar had taken Lyanna all those years ago, he held a deep-seated hatred for all things Targaryen, a hatred that had not cooled even after 15 years of peace on the Iron Throne. He said he wanted the girl, her child, and her brother dead, and he wanted them dead now. Ned could not believe what he was hearing. The Robert Baratheon he knew was not a child killer. But then he thought on what Cat had told him in Winterfell those many moons ago. The Robert who sat before him drinking and arguing and bellowing was not the Robert he had known as a boy, was not the man who he had fought beside during the rebellion. This man was a stranger to him, and he wanted nothing to do with him. So he told Robert to do as he saw fit, and told him that he was resigning the handship. Robert blustered and bellowed, but Ned walked out of the council chambers with a much freer conscience than he had walking into it that morning. He had asked Vayan to go looking for the fastest ship that could take himself and his girls home. And he had thought perhaps on the way back they could stop in Dragonstone and he could speak with Stannis Baratheon and see what it was that he and Jon Arryn had been researching when Jon had died and Stannis had fled. Then Littlefinger had come and told him that he had something of import to show him, something to do with why Jon Arryn had been killed. He led him to a brothel where a babe was suckling on her mother's teat. The babe was named Bella, and there was no mistaking whose child she was. Robert's dark hair and blue eyes were evident in her face, and Ned was taken back in time to the Vale, and a similar girl whose name was Maya and whose mother had been some serving girl Robert had bedded at a feast, and soon forgotten about. "Are you well looked after, child?" Ned asked Bella's mother. She was no older than Lya had been when she had died in a bed of blood. "Yes, but please my lord tell him I've been with no other since. Tell him I love him and that Bella loves him." "You'll tell him, won't you?" the girl asked. "Promise me you'll tell him. Promise me, Ned." Ned shivered in the warm summer light. I'll tell him." Littlefinger led him out of the brothel and then turned to him. "Do you see it now? Do you understand why you must stay here? Why you cannot leave?" Ned looked at the man, at Cat's friend. He wanted to reply but found he could not, and besides by the time he found the words to speak, another man was calling him. Lord Stark. What a delightful surprise. It was Jaime Lannister dressed, gilded golden armor, the Lion of Lannister. Sir Jaime, Ned began. What can I do for you? I would have words with you, the man replied. Ned looked around him. Do these words require you to bring 20 armed men? Can we not have discussion like civilized men? That depends, my lord, the Kingslayer replied. Depends? On what? Ned asked. On why your wife has taken my brother hostage to the Vale. Ned groaned. Cat, what have you done? Because I asked her to, he said. Very well then, Jaime Lannister drew his steel. I'll get help, he heard Littlefinger say. Ned drew his own sword. Then it was the dance of steel on steel, a dance he had not had since the Tower of Joy. His sword clashed with Lannister men's swords. He cut the throat of one man. He pierced the chest of another. He gutted the third. Beside him Jory Castle, Will and Hullen fought the Lannister men. He had a distant memory of 6 wraiths fighting in the heat of Dorne many years ago, but he was torn from his memory by the sound of screaming. He turned to see Hullen fall to the ground, a sword through his throat. Will soon fell as well. Jory was next. The Kingslayer pierced his throat with his gilded sword and tore him in two. Ned felt the rage, wolf's blood that he had never truly suffered from. Not like Brandon and Lya. Take a hold of him then, and he fought like a man possessed. He hacked and slashed at the Kingslayer. He nicked and dented the man's armor, just as the man nicked him. He cut the man across the cheek and was just about to lunge in for another strike when he felt a sharp pain in his leg. One of the Lannister men had buried their spear in his left leg. He was forced to kneel down on the ground. He saw Jaime Lannister kill the offending man, and then he felt the cold steel of the man's sword on his throat. You have been warned, Lord Stark. The man rode off, then galloping on his warhorse, perhaps back to Casterly Rock. Ned knew not, nor did he truly care. His leg hurt to high hell. He fell over trying to get to Jory. That was how Littlefinger and the City Watch found him. Spread eagled on the ground, his hand near Jory Castle's face, blood pouring from the wound in his leg. Alice. Winterfell was a much bigger castle than Carhold. That much was for sure. Where Carhold had been a strong fortified but small castle, Winterfell seemed like a behemoth in comparison. And even with the large part of the household having gone south with Lord Eddard, there were still plenty of people to fill out the vacant jobs that had been left. There were still plenty of people to till the fields, see to the stores, and to make steel in the forge. There were times, of course, where Alice missed Carhold. When the stress of being the Lady of Winterfell got too much, she would often think of her mother and her siblings back home in Carhold, and the easy life she had had back then. Of course, her husband did much to ease her homesickness and tiredness. Many a night once Bran and Rickon had been put to bed, they would talk to one another in their chambers and would often end the night making love, finishing sprawled out on the bed, their clothes a jumble of disarray. She knew Robb was doing his best to manage as Lord of Winterfell in his father's absence. He was working so hard that sometimes he would not come to bed till the early hours of the morning, the first rays of sunlight beginning to creep through. She knew that when his mother, Lady Catelyn, had kept her vigil beside Bran's bedside, Robb had shouldered all the responsibility and the burden, and it had started to get to him. There were lines and creases forming on his handsome face, and there were worry lines constantly present as well. Then the assassin had come and tried to kill Bran and Lady Catelyn, and then everything had gone mad. Lady Catelyn had told them how she had received a letter from her sister blaming the Lannisters, especially the Queen, for her husband, Jon Arryn's death, and she believed that the Lannisters had been behind this attack as well, and so she had set off for King's Landing to speak with Lord Eddard and seek justice. Whilst they waited to receive word from either Lady Catelyn or Lord Eddard, Tyrion Lannister had come to Winterfell. Now, with the whole of Winterfell having heard of the attack on their lady and their lady's son, and with Robb having taken his mother's warnings of the Lannisters to heart, it was no surprise that the Lannisters' reception on his way back to King's Landing had been a cold one. She could have cut the tension in the room with a knife and still had some left over. Oh, Lord Tyrion was polite enough, but she could see the way his eyes were sizing Robb up, the way they were analyzing his every word and action. It was almost as if he was plotting something that might explain why the Lannisters were behind Bran's attack. And then he had gone and surprised them all by giving Bran a saddle to allow him to ride again. That had completely stumped all of them, though Lord Tyrion had claimed that he was merely doing Robb's cousin Jon a favor. After they had retired, she could tell that Robb was beginning to have his doubts about the Lannisters being involved. Well, perhaps not all the Lannisters, maybe just Lord Tyrion. And she also knew that the golden curl they had found in the broken tower must have come from a Lannister. So she was not surprised when Robb had asked her whether or not he should ask Tyrion to make some inquiries about the curl. She had told him to sleep on it and decided in the morning, for she had had more important news to tell him: she was pregnant. Robb's face had changed then. It had gone from being completely somber and serious to complete joy. He had smiled and kissed her till they were both breathless, and then had asked, "Are you sure?" She had laughed then and smiled. "Of course I'm sure, Robb. I haven't bled for 2 moons now." He had smiled then, not the Lord's smile he often used in court, but a true and proper smile, the smile he had had on the day of their wedding.